It's the late 18th century, and suddenly, everything is buzzing, not metaphorically, literally. There's something new in the air, something strange, invisible, and oddly powerful. It can make frogs twitch, it can make your hair stand on end, it might even be the force of life itself. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the historical stage, electricity, the Victorian equivalent of discovering Wi-Fi and black magic on the same day. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Victorians thought electricity could cure everything, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Before the Victorians dove headfirst into zapping themselves with healing belts and shocking water bottles, the groundwork had to be laid by a few curious minds who had no idea they were about to kick off a cultural frenzy. Enter Galvani, an 18th century Italian scientist who made the accidental discovery that twitching frog legs and electricity go together like corsets and fainting couches. While dissecting frogs as one does apparently on a quiet weekend, Galvani noticed that their legs twitched when touched with metal during a lightning storm. His conclusion? Electricity was part of life itself, a vital force running through all living beings. The frog did not agree to this, by the way. Then came Alessandro Volta, a man who heard Galvani's ideas and said, "Interesting, but what if I invented batteries instead?" Volta's creation of the first battery, the voltaic pile, allowed scientists to generate a steady stream of electricity without waiting for storms or dead frogs. This was revolutionary. Now you didn't need a thundercloud to make your neighbor's cat yowl in confusion. You just needed some metal discs and a strong desire to poke things. Fast forward to Michael Faraday, the Victorian rock star of electromagnetism. He figured out how to create electricity using magnets and movement, and laid the foundation for the electric motor. He was the guy who made electricity useful, not just spooky. Faraday gave lectures to packed crowds at the Royal Institution, some of which included making hair stand up on children's heads while wearing balloons on stage. Early Victorian science, part discovery, part party trick, and entirely too flammable. Now, here's the thing about the Victorians. They absolutely loved a good spectacle. This was a society that went nuts over seances, phrenology, and that time someone brought a mummy to dinner. So when electricity started crackling into public consciousness, it wasn't just seen as science. No, it was seen as magic that might be science, or science that might be magic. Same difference. That's how we ended up with static electricity parties. Yes, these were actual social events. In the mid-1800s, well-to-do Victorians would gather in parlors and salons not to dance or play charades, but to shock each other. Hosts would rent out primitive electrostatic generators, hand-cranked machines with glass globes and brass rods, and invite their guests to hold hands in long chains while the machine gave them a jolt. Sometimes the electricity would be used to make people's hair stand on end or to light up fluorescent tubes held in their mouths. Nothing says classy soiree like becoming a human lightning rod after a round of tea. One favorite activity, creating a circle of shock. Everyone would stand in a ring, hands clasped, while one unfortunate soul touched the generator. The spark would travel through all of them in a giant human daisy chain of regret and giggling. To the Victorians, this wasn't weird, it was high entertainment, and because science still wore top hats and smelled faintly of pipe smoke, it also felt respectable. Another popular parlor trick, using electricity to make metal filings dance on paper, levitate small objects, or, somewhat alarmingly, make animals spasm slightly. Not exactly humane by today's standards, but to Victorian minds it was a peek into a new electric world, one where everything was possible, even reviving the dead, if you shocked hard enough. Electricity wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a mood, and a very on-trend one. Newspapers breathlessly reported on new electric experiments, and some early fiction writers like Mary Shelley tapped into its dramatic potential. Frankenstein, after all, was written right around the time Galvani and Volta were electrifying frogs and metal, and it reflects the awe and fear that came with this new force. Electricity became a symbol of power, life, progress, and occasionally party games that left a burn mark on your hand. Victorian fascination with electricity wasn't grounded in reality so much as hopeful misunderstanding. It was the force that promised light, healing, motion, and even immortality. Never mind the lack of real safety protocols or consistent results. If your parlor lamp flickered when you laughed too hard, that was probably just the spirit of progress, or maybe the cat chewing the wire. In short, the Victorian era didn't just welcome electricity, they romanced it. It was the mysterious stranger with a dark coat and a dangerous buzz. And before long, Victorians would invite it into their homes, their health routines, and occasionally their underpants. But before we get there, let's look at how this newfound electrical obsession turned into a full-blown medical movement, complete with quack doctors, buzzing belts, and the occasional nosebleed. The Victorians were a people of industry, curiosity, and absolutely no chill when it came to experimenting on their own bodies. So when electricity burst onto the scene in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was only a matter of time before someone thought, you know what this migraine needs? A nice jolt to the skull. And so began the wild and questionably grounded world of electrotherapy, a trend that would shock its way into the Victorian medical scene with equal parts enthusiasm and confusion. Let's be clear from the start. Victorians didn't really understand electricity. Most doctors at the time couldn't have told you the difference between alternating current and a strong gust of wind. But that didn't stop them from using it to treat everything from gout to gout's more fashionable cousin, hysteria. The reasoning was this: electricity made dead frogs twitch, so surely it could do something helpful for your aching knees, sluggish organs, or fading enthusiasm for life. At the core of this belief was an ancient and very persistent idea that the human body ran on invisible energies. In the old days it was called the four humours. Health depended on a delicate balance of black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. We'll pause here so you can cringe appropriately. Victorians had largely moved past humours in theory, but the idea that illness stemmed from internal imbalance of forces, fluids or energy stuck around like a bad case of Victorian plumbing. Enter electricity, the new wonder force. It was invisible, it moved, it sparked, it felt like life itself. Naturally, many Victorians believed that illness was simply a sign that the body's nervous system had gone to sleep, or worse, was failing to conduct its vital energy properly. If you were tired, weak, anxious, or just vaguely unwell, the logic went like this: maybe your wires were loose and you just needed a good jolt to wake up your inner circuits. Thus, electrotherapy was born. The early methods were experimental. Some doctors used large Leyden jars, early capacitors that stored static electricity, to deliver short, sharp shocks. Patients were told to hold metal rods while someone cranked a machine that would reawaken their vitality. Often there was no real dosage control, just vibes and voltage. It was a bit like having your house rewired by an enthusiastic raccoon. And what did electrotherapy supposedly cure? The better question is, what didn't it? Doctors promised relief from arthritis, paralysis, insomnia, digestive troubles, melancholy, depression, female disorders, kidney stones, headaches, impotence, and the Victorian catch-all diagnosis for anything vaguely inconvenient: nervous exhaustion. If your body wasn't functioning at full speed, perhaps you just needed to be turned off and on again like a misbehaving toaster. Electrotherapy devices quickly flooded the market. Medical offices began to advertise their new electrical machines as cutting-edge treatments, often combining them with hypnosis, magnetism, or herbal tonics to cover all their pseudoscientific bases. Some used galvanic stimulation, which applied a continuous current to muscles to produce contractions. The results were rarely consistent, and often just involved the patient twitching slightly and reporting, "Well, I felt something." To a Victorian mind, that something was proof of progress. One popular idea was that the nerves themselves were like telegraph wires, a perfect metaphor for an era obsessed with speed, steam, and signal. If a limb was paralyzed, perhaps the nervous line had gone dead, and electricity could reroute the message. It made just enough sense to seem scientific, but not enough sense to actually work reliably. Still, many patients swore by it. After all, if you spent a week being lightly electrocuted, you'd want to believe it helped. And then came the early debates in the medical community. Was electrotherapy real science? Was it a hoax? Was it simply wishful thinking in a brass-plated box? The answer was yes to all three. Some doctors genuinely believed in its power. Others were skeptics, concerned about the lack of evidence, the inconsistent results, and the occasional patient who walked in with a stiff neck and left with their hair smoking. But electrotherapy was fashionable, and in Victorian medicine, fashion often trumped fact. Meanwhile, society lapped it up. Wealthy households began installing personal devices for light home treatment. Advertisements claimed that a few minutes of electroshock a day would restore your youth, refresh your nerves, and put that rebellious spleen back in its place. Testimonials abounded. After just 3 treatments, my indigestion was gone and I could hear again. No word on whether this was due to the electricity or the sudden fear of a repeat visit. Of course, the Victorians didn't worry too much about side effects. This was an era when cocaine was considered a perfectly reasonable teething gel for babies. So what if a little electricity made your hands tingle, your vision blur, or your knees buckle slightly? That just meant it was working. The logic was simple. Feeling tired? Just plug yourself in and hope you don't catch fire. In the end, electrotherapy became a defining part of 19th century medicine, not because it worked all the time, but because it captured the imagination. It represented progress, modernity, and control over the body's mysterious workings. And as long as it looked impressive, Victorians were happy to be zapped into wellness. Next up, we'll dive into the world of home-use devices, the wearable gadgets, belts, and buzz boxes that let you bring your favorite shocking experience right to your living room. Because nothing says health like strapping a battery to your torso and hoping for the best. If the Victorian era had a motto, it might have been, "Why let a doctor shock you when you can do it yourself at home?" And so began the golden age of electrical self-help gadgets, a wondrous time when the only thing more shocking than the devices was the marketing behind them. As electricity's reputation as a cure-all spread, opportunistic entrepreneurs across Britain and America realized something important. You didn't need scientific proof to sell a medical device. You just needed brass knobs, a catchy name, and a whole lot of enthusiastic adjectives. This was the dawn of the home electromedicine kit, and it was about to flood parlors, catalogs, and very confused bedrooms. These devices promised everything: renewed vitality, restored youth, instant energy, and an overall sense that your nerves were doing jumping jacks of joy. The most iconic, the electric belt, a device so popular that it could be found strapped to waists across the empire, buzzing softly under layers of tweed. These belts came in many varieties. Some had copper plates, others had galvanic cells sewn into the lining. A few models even required daily dousing with salt water to activate their powers. But they all had one thing in common: they barely worked. Yes, many of them did technically produce a current, just enough to create a faint tingle if the stars aligned. The humidity was right and you'd rubbed it with bacon grease or something equally strange as per the instruction manual. Still, the sayings were relentless: reinvigorate your manhood, zap away the fog of nervous exhaustion, restore your vital magnetism, guaranteed, or your dignity back. And these were just the belts. There were also electric brushes that claimed to stimulate hair growth with every stroke, though most users just ended up with frizz and regret. Electrified combs offered the promise of taming unruly Victorian facial hair with the precision of a thundercloud, and for the fashion-forward invalid, electric corsets promised posture correction, internal massage, and the occasional unintended electrocution. If you flipped through the pages of a Victorian health catalogue, you'd be greeted with dozens of these glowing testimonials and ink-drenched diagrams. A man with a tragic moustache might be standing proudly in an electro-vital suit, pointing confidently at his abdomen like it had just recited poetry. Women were shown lying peacefully in bed, hooked up to devices that looked like miniature Frankenstein labs, the captions promising relief from female weaknesses, backaches, or anything that might be blamed on a uterus. One particularly aggressive brand, Pulvermacher's chains, sold electromagnetic chains that could be wrapped around virtually any part of the body. They were flexible, fashionable, sort of, and about as effective as a wet necklace. Still, customers raved about them. Why? Because the placebo effect in the Victorian era came with lightning bolts. If you believed your backache would vanish because a buzzing chain said so, it probably felt better, until you stood too close to a gas lamp and caught fire. Traveling salesmen also got in on the action. They'd haul their buzzing gadgets from town to town, delivering dramatic demonstrations in rented halls or knocking on doors like electrified door-to-door prophets. These devices would light up little bulbs, spark across coils, or make volunteer hands twitch just enough to impress the crowd. The sales pitch usually went something like, "This marvel of modern medical science uses galvanic force to reinvigorate your nerves, clear your brain fog, and return you to the vigor of your youth. Now only 5 shillings and it'll even make your crops grow taller." Did the devices work? Not really, but they looked scientific. That was the real genius of it. With their brass gears, insulated wires, leather straps, and current intensity knobs that did absolutely nothing, these gadgets felt like science to the average person. They hummed, they sparked, they had dials, and because nobody knew exactly how electricity was supposed to behave, no one could prove they weren't working. You could wear an electric belt for months and still be just as tired and unmagnetized as ever, but hey, it might be helping. The most brilliant part of the whole operation, the language. These devices were never gadgets. They were therapeutic instruments. You weren't wearing a strap-on battery, you were undergoing electrovital reconstitution therapy. Even the least effective contraptions sounded impressive when they used phrases like biomagnetic restoration or nerve galvanization. It was the snake oil of science, served with a copper wire and a gentleman's accent. And lest you think these gadgets were confined to the rich or the gullible, consider this. Entire factories were devoted to churning out these products. There were distribution chains, export businesses, even counterfeit versions of popular belts, fake medicine if you will. Electrotherapy had become a full-blown industry, one that churned out more static than results. Still, the Victorians loved it. After all, what could be more modern than treating your health issues by electrifying your midsection and brushing your scalp with a thunderstorm on a stick? Nothing says cutting-edge science like a belt that makes your pants buzz. So the world of home electrotherapy marched on, buzzing, glowing, and slightly humming under people's clothing. And in a world where doctors were expensive and real medicine was slow to develop, many people genuinely found comfort in strapping on a device and believing they were taking charge of their health 1 volt at a time. But not all electrotherapy was worn under your waistcoat. Some of it was designed to spice up your love life. And yes, it gets way weirder from here. When electricity sparked its way into the medical world, it wasn't long before someone had the idea, what if we used this to fix, down there? And thus a whole new genre of quackery was born, intimate electrotherapy devices, designed to restore vitality, vigor, manly energy and feminine tranquility, all without ever saying the words, frankly, I just need a good time. Let's start with the men, because Victorian advertising had a field day selling anxiety to them. If you were a gentleman in the 1800s and you woke up one day feeling tired, uninspired, and slightly limp in your ambitions, the diagnosis was almost certainly one of the era's favorite nonsense terms: male exhaustion, nervous debility, or the all-encompassing horror of lost manhood. These were not medical conditions. They were clever, terrifyingly vague labels designed to make any man fear he was slowly turning into a decorative umbrella stand. The solution? According to every health catalogue from London to Boston, you just needed to electrify your trousers. Enter the Pulvermacher belt, the most famous and arguably most scandalous electrical device of its kind, officially called the Pulvermacher electro-galvanic chain belt. It promised to restore power, invigorate weak nerves, and stimulate the reproductive organs with the noble force of science. In practice, it was a flexible, battery-laced strap that wrapped around the hips and dangled rather conspicuously into delicate zones. It was advertised as medically approved. It was sold in pharmacies. It was even endorsed by a few not quite reputable doctors. But make no mistake, this was not about spinal alignment or nerve restoration. This was about putting a live wire near your most sensitive real estate and praying the battery didn't overperform. Still, the sayings were careful not to say anything improper. Euphemisms ran wild. Stimulates the organs of generation, restores manly magnetism and youthful strength. For those suffering from nocturnal weakness or private discouragement. Translation: if your bedroom performance had become more of a Victorian tragedy than a romantic opera, the Pulvermacher belt was here to help, provided you didn't mind a light electrical tingling and some truly awkward chafing. Of course, women were also prime targets for the new world of private electrotherapy. And because the 19th century loved to pathologize women's emotions, desires, and general existence, a whole range of products were sold to treat female hysteria. Now, hysteria was a wildly unscientific umbrella diagnosis that could refer to just about anything: anxiety, depression, irritability, fatigue, or simply the audacity of a woman wanting more out of life than embroidery and childbirth. The cure? Gentle electrical stimulation of the pelvic region. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Doctors and health specialists developed devices that could deliver vibrations or small electrical currents to what they referred to, with maximum awkwardness, as the lower nerve centers. These were not openly discussed in polite society, but they were absolutely marketed and frequently used as tools for relieving tension in women. You were told it was for your nerves, your uterine stagnation, or your internal pressures, but what you got was a proto-vibrator plugged into a wall socket and shaped like an overly optimistic candlestick. Home use models eventually followed. Some looked like hairdryers, some looked like phonograph horns. All of them were loudly clinical in design but left little to the imagination once activated. These devices became so widespread that many women visited their doctor, not because they were ill, but because the treatments felt good. The medical community responded by inventing increasingly complex machines and pretending they still had no idea what was going on. Because heaven forbid anyone admit that the key to women's emotional well-being might be pleasure rather than prayers and corsets. Even catalogs got in on the coded language game. One 1890s ad for a lady's vibrating massage device claimed it helped with circulatory health, complexion improvement, muscular tone, and overall satisfaction. We're just surprised it didn't promise better knitting technique and a cleaner soul while it was at it. All of this raises an important point. Victorian electrotherapy wasn't just a medical fad. It was a full-blown cultural coping mechanism. People were desperate for solutions to problems they didn't fully understand and weren't allowed to talk about openly. Electricity offered a way to deal with intimacy, aging, dysfunction, and desire under the respectable umbrella of health and science. Victorian intimacy, lights off, corsets on, and batteries fully charged. Did these devices actually work? That depends on your definition of success. Some probably did deliver mild stimulation or placebo-based relief. Others may have just startled users into forgetting what their original problem was, and more than a few likely ended with scorched undergarments and difficult conversations with the housemaid. Still, the Victorians pressed on, clutching their electrodes, trusting their catalogue orders, and whispering about vital energy in tones that suggested everything but medical concern. And this was just the beginning, because once you've shocked your loins into wellness, it's only a short leap to believing you can zap your internal organs back into working order too. Next stop, tongue electrodes, eye shocks, and devices that really shouldn't be allowed near plumbing. By the mid-19th century, Victorians had already strapped electricity to their waists, buzzed their scalps, and gently vibrated their most private regrets into submission, all in the name of health. But as with all things Victorian, moderation was not the vibe. If electricity could awaken tired limbs and restore intimate vitality, Why not go deeper? Literally, thus began the next great leap in electromedicine, internal zapping. Yes, you read that correctly. It wasn't enough to tingle your arms or belt your loins. The real believers, the ones truly committed to the electrified lifestyle, began sending tiny currents inside their bodies in ways that would make a modern neurologist weep into their lab coat. It started with big promises. Quack practitioners and self-declared nerve specialists claimed that electricity could treat any internal dysfunction. Deafness, paralysis, baldness, migraines, constipation, kidney stones, even epilepsy, all could be corrected with the strategic application of voltage. According to the brochures, your body was just a complex circuit board waiting to be debugged by divine amperage. One ad promised that electrotherapy revitalizes the intestinal rhythm. Another swore it could rewire the memory. A particularly bold pamphlet claimed it had cured a man of spiritual fatigue, which sounds like the Victorian version of burnout, but with more candles and fewer coping strategies. So what did these treatments look like? Imagine walking into a posh consulting room, decorated with velvet curtains and faint smells of lavender and ozone. The doctor, wearing a monocle and probably a thin moustache of dubious moral alignment, would offer you a seat and then ask the least comforting question ever. Now, where would you like the electrodes inserted? Because here's the thing. Victorians were not shy about sticking wires where wires absolutely shouldn't go. Let's begin with the head. For cases of deafness, physicians would place electrodes directly into patients' ears and deliver controlled shocks to stimulate the auditory nerve. In theory, this would reawaken hearing. In practice, it usually reawakened trauma and occasionally produced the faint smell of singed earwax. For headaches, they'd do the same with the tongue or the nasal cavity. Patients were told to hold a rod under their tongue while the doctor turned the dial, sending currents through their jaw and face. One gentleman described the experience as a bracing sensation, akin to being slapped in the soul. No reports were made about curing the headache, probably because no one could focus long enough after being electrocuted in the uvula. Eyes were also fair game. Electrodes were placed on the temples, or even directly over the eyelids to revitalize optic flow. A few brave souls claimed improved vision afterward. Most just saw static and had to lie down for a week. And then there were the cavity treatments. Let's not sugarcoat it. Victorians were shoving electricity into every orifice they could reach. Devices were made specifically for insertion into the rectum, vagina, and even the urethra, claiming to treat everything from constipation to impotence to hysteronervous conditions. These were sold in respectable medical catalogues with names like the rectal rejuvenator or electrogastrostimulator, which sound like rejected Transformers villains. One notable design was a long, slender rod attached to a hand-crank battery. Patients were instructed to gently introduce the applicator and then administer low-level current for up to 20 minutes. This was said to energize the intestines or relax the pelvic channels. What it usually did was freak out the entire nervous system and occasionally make people swear off vegetables for life. And again, the marketing was bold but politely phrased. For those troubled by sluggish digestion, sedentary torpor, or general feelings of bodily inertia. Translation: got a headache? Stick a wire in your ear and pray it doesn't come out your nose. One woman reportedly wrote a testimonial claiming she had been transformed from a woman of great misery to one of divine clarity after 20 treatments of vaginal electrotherapy. She failed to mention if she could still sit properly. Now, to be fair, not everything was nonsense. Some early practitioners were honestly trying to understand the nervous system, and they genuinely believed electricity might reboot parts of the body suffering from trauma or disease. But without proper understanding of dosage, anatomy, or electrical safety, the results ranged from mildly annoying to medically catastrophic. And let's not forget the machines themselves. Most of these internal treatment devices were hand-cranked, with no voltage regulator. This meant that the strength of the current depended entirely on the doctor's enthusiasm, or in the case of home use, your spouse's arm stamina. Too little, and you felt nothing. Too much, and suddenly you were seeing your ancestors in vivid detail. Safety protocols were imaginative. Instructions often warned not to exceed 5 cranks of vigor, or advised testing the device upon one's hand before proceeding to the nether circuits. Some users wisely ignored this advice and lived to tell the tale. Others may still be humming faintly in their graves. Despite the absurdity, these treatments remained popular for decades. Why? Because the alternatives were just as bad. If you weren't being electrocuted for your constipation, you were probably being prescribed arsenic pills or laudanum enemas. In that context, a few sparks might have seemed like a reasonable option. In the end, Victorian internal electrotherapy was less about results and more about hope. Hope that the mystery of the body could be solved by science. Hope that you could feel better with just a jolt. Hope that maybe, just maybe, today's treatment wouldn't end with someone yelling, "I think it's smoking." Up next, we're taking a break from the anatomy and diving into the surprisingly fashionable world of wearable electric fashion corsets that tingle, jewelry that hums, and Victorian style that came with its own static charge. Fashion tip: if your outfit doesn't tingle or hum, is it even Victorian? In a time when hats were tall enough to store secrets and corsets could crush a ribcage into a fine dust, the Victorians still managed to look around and ask, how can we make clothing buzz? Because once electrotherapy slithered into the bloodstream of 19th century medicine, it didn't stop at the doctor's office. Oh no, it strutted straight down the street, humming softly, occasionally sparking, and insisting that voltage could be as chic as velvet. Welcome to the electric fashion scene where wellness met wardrobe, and your outfit wasn't complete unless it came with a mild current and at least one burning sensation. Let's start with electrothermic vests, the must-have garment for the nervous gentleman or overly dramatic hypochondriac. These were padded undergarments fitted with wire coils and powered by pocket-sized batteries or hand-cranked generators. Some versions included metal plates stitched into the fabric, warmed by electrical current, and marketed as ideal for rheumatic pains, lung deficiencies, or simply a lack of robust chest energy, a diagnosis as vague as it was Victorian. These vests came with bold claims: increased blood flow, improved organ function, and a stimulating inner warmth which sounds suspiciously like they just made you sweat. Still, fashion-conscious Victorians wore them under their waistcoats with pride. Who needed a coal fire when your torso was lightly broiling from within? For the ladies, the crown jewel of wearable wellness was the electric corset, a garment that already held the record for most likely to end in rib displacement. But now, with the addition of copper wiring and battery pouches, it promised to realign your spine and your soul. These corsets were marketed as a miracle for posture, circulation, and female tranquility. The idea was that the current would encourage your muscles to sit up straight and fly right, all while giving your internal organs a gentle toning massage. A few models even claimed to restore youthful bloom by stimulating blood flow to the cheeks, though it's unclear whether that was from improved circulation or the panic of being mildly electrocuted while sitting in church. And of course, because this was Victorian England and appearances were everything, electricity also had to make you look better. That's where the static charged hairbrush came in. These odd little gadgets were made with rubberized handles, metal bristles, and a built-in mechanism, often a rotating magnet or crank, that produced a gentle charge. Brushing your hair with one was said to invigorate the follicles, strengthen scalp nerves, and encourage luxurious hair growth. Some ads claimed it could turn grey hair dark again. Others whispered that it might even restore lost curls. The truth? It made your hair stand on end like you'd just insulted a ghost. But hey, if you looked stimulated, wasn't that a kind of beauty? Then there was glowing jewelry. Yes, literal light-up accessories. Certain brooches, necklaces, and pendants were fitted with tiny bulbs or phosphorescent stones that glowed faintly, powered by hidden wires and tiny batteries tucked into pouches or cleverly concealed inside hats. These were often marketed as fashionable health charms, said to harmonize your aura, stabilize your mood, or ward off toxic vapors, which, let's be honest, were probably just caused by bad sewage. Speaking of hats, Let's not forget the battery-powered top hat, a real accessory sold to dapper Victorian gents who wanted to look sharp and spark slightly. Some were novelty items that lit up the rim of the hat with tiny bulbs. Victorian rave gear, basically. Others included internal heating mechanisms to keep your head warm in winter, or mild current stimulators that zapped the scalp and were sold as brain boosters. Better memory, claimed one ad, begins with an electrified crown. Even footwear got the treatment. Special electric insoles were sold to revitalize tired feet, stimulate sluggish circulation, and give your walk a brisker, younger quality. These insoles were usually made of layered copper and zinc plates, designed to generate a small galvanic reaction when moistened by sweat. That's right, these shoes were powered by your foot moisture. The future was now, and it smelled faintly like socks. But beyond the gadgets themselves, it was the marketing that really sold the dream. Advertisements promised that with the right electro-fashion, you could literally wear your health. You didn't need tonics or rest or unpleasant medical exams. Just wrap yourself in a few volts and strut through the drawing room like a walking battery. The language was, as always, peak Victorian confidence. Invigorate your complexion with the gentle radiance of our illuminated tiara. Reinforce posture and purify the lungs with the electrospinal crinoline. Promenade with poise in magnetized gaiters where elegance meets amperage. And let's be real, some people probably did feel better. There's something psychologically powerful about believing your clothing is healing you. If your corset hummed with mysterious energy and your top hat lit up like a gas lamp, you felt modern, fashionable, scientific, electrically superior to your neighbors, who had the nerve to wear ordinary crinolines like cave people. Fashion tip: if your outfit doesn't tingle or hum, is it even Victorian? Of course, none of this was without its hazards. Stories abounded of scorched undergarments, hats that shorted out during rainstorms, and hairbrushes that delivered unintended facial spasms. But in an age when people still used mercury as a face cream and arsenic as a breath freshener, a little shock now and then was the least of your worries. Next, we'll look at how actual doctors began to raise an eyebrow at all this electro-couture, because when your patient shows up humming softly and smelling of scorched linen, someone has to finally say, maybe don't wear the battery. As the 19th century crackled along, so did the Victorian obsession with electricity. From belts to corsets to eyebrow-singeing hairbrushes, it seemed like every organ, limb, and uncomfortable itch had its own electric fix. But while enthusiastic salesmen were out zapping the masses and touting their galvano-rejuvenating nose probes, there was one group watching from the sidelines with deepening horror: the actual scientists. To them, the booming electromania was less a medical revolution and more of a slow-motion tea-stained train wreck. The line between scientific discovery and public nonsense was being cheerfully trampled by people in battery-powered underwear, and nowhere was that divide clearer than in the growing tension between real physicists and Victorian medical quackery. Let's rewind a little. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, brilliant minds like Galvani, Alessandro Volta, and later Michael Faraday were laying the groundwork for understanding electricity's role in biology and physics. Galvani's famous frog leg experiments had shown that muscles could contract when exposed to electrical stimulation. Volta built the first chemical battery, and Faraday, one of the era's true scientific icons, discovered electromagnetic induction, the principles that would eventually power your toaster. These were not men selling electrified mustache combs. These were meticulous researchers, obsessed with measurable, repeatable, peer-reviewed science. They didn't claim electricity could cure your kidney stones and your marriage. They were too busy trying to figure out how electricity worked at all. But here's the problem. The public didn't want nuance. They wanted miracles. They saw a frog twitch on a metal plate and thought, aha, electricity, life. So if your knees hurt, your vision blurred, or your libido had packed up and left for the season, surely you just needed a bit more juice. This led to a public health disaster dressed in tweed. The electrotherapy industry, filled with self-proclaimed medical electricians, was more about sales than science, and the devices they sold often had only the faintest connection to real research. A classic example: the misuse of Galvani's experiments. He had shown that electrical signals could cause muscles to contract. He did not say it would cure your arthritis if you strapped a galvanometer to your elbow and prayed to the voltage gods. Faraday, for his part, was deeply skeptical of the electro-hysteria gripping society. While he continued to experiment in controlled laboratory conditions, he distanced himself from anything resembling public cures. His scientific papers were full of warnings against overgeneralizing the effects of electricity, but those warnings were drowned out by advertisements claiming that zapping your spleen would unlock your inner harmony. It wasn't just scientists who were alarmed. Licensed physicians began to grow concerned too. Hospitals and medical schools had begun to dabble in electrical treatments, particularly for nerve-related conditions like paralysis or muscle atrophy. But these were closely monitored, careful procedures based on limited and evolving evidence. Then along came the traveling salesman with a brass-plated electro-helmet claiming to reverse baldness in just 10 shocks a day, and all medical credibility went straight out the gaslit window. Many doctors published scathing reviews in medical journals of the time, warning the public that electrocuratives were not just ineffective, but potentially dangerous. People were using high-voltage devices unsupervised, suffering burns, nerve damage, and occasionally turning their at-home treatment sessions into miniature lightning strikes. There were even cases of patients being hospitalized because of excessive electrotherapy. But as always, reason was no match for good marketing. The line between genuine research and snake oil was blurred further by devices that did produce a real sensation. Many of the gadgets for sale, especially those involving galvanic current, actually made muscles twitch or created a tingling feeling. To the average person, that was proof enough. "I felt it do something," they'd say, not realizing that the something might just be nerve confusion or minor electrocution. In some cases, even educated doctors were swept up in the hype. Lacking modern scientific controls, they trusted anecdotal results, especially if the patient claimed to feel better after a good zapping. And let's face it, when your other treatment options were bloodletting or mercury pills, a little static shock must have seemed downright comforting. Eventually, medical organizations began cracking down. By the late 1800s, regulatory bodies formed to monitor electrical quackery. Some of the more dangerous devices were banned, and the more absurd claims like curing tuberculosis with a copper coil stuffed in your hat were publicly debunked. Still, the public's love affair with electro-miracles didn't die out easily. Even as science moved toward germ theory and real diagnostics, plenty of people clung to the idea that all they needed was one more zap in the spleen, and they'd be dancing again by Friday. Actual doctors were like, "Please stop electrocuting yourselves, Victorians." But what if we did it harder? In the end, the conflict between real science and Victorian voltage mania was a classic case of hope versus evidence. Electricity, mysterious and powerful, had the misfortune of being just understandable enough to inspire trust, but not understood enough to prevent wildly inappropriate uses. And if you're wondering whether this divide between real science and health fads has disappeared in modern times, well, there are still people sticking crystals in their ears and calling it quantum healing. So maybe the Victorians were just ahead of their time, dangerously, flamboyantly, and electrically so. If the Victorian era had a guiding principle, it was this: never underestimate society's ability to invent an illness for something perfectly normal. Enter the grand, hand-wringing spectacle of female hysteria, the one-size-fits-all diagnosis for everything from sadness and stress to frustration, indigestion, or the vague crime of wanting things. And while men got electric belts and nerve tonics, women were treated to something even more electrifying: therapeutic machines designed to calm the womb by literally vibrating it into submission. Let's start with the basic assumption. Victorian doctors believed that the female body was ruled entirely by her reproductive organs, which were thought to have the power to control emotions, moods, even logic itself. A woman feeling anxious, her uterus was probably misaligned. Sadness, clearly the ovaries were draining her vitality. A woman expressing strong opinions in public, the diagnosis was urgent: overstimulated nerves. womb-based neurosis, or wandering uterus disorder. And what was the catch-all name for this supposed soup of symptoms? Hysteria. The term came from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, because obviously if a woman was faint, tearful, or annoyed by her husband's 6th hour of reading railway timetables aloud, the real issue had to be uterine weather conditions. Doctors, wanting to be helpful and profitable, created a dizzying number of devices to treat this condition. Chief among them were mechanical massage tools. Early, doctor-operated vibrators designed to relieve pelvic congestion through localized stimulation. In plainer terms, the doctor would apply the machine to the woman's lower abdomen until she experienced what medical literature coyly called hysterical paroxysm. Yes, this was exactly what it sounds like. No, they didn't admit it. In fact, most physicians insisted they were simply performing a clinical duty, with no pleasure involved. One 1880s medical guide assured its readers that the treatment was no more erotic than milking a cow, an alarming sentence if there ever was one. Yet the popularity of the treatment was undeniable. Upper and middle-class women began flocking to clinics for weekly or sometimes daily appointments, citing relief from insomnia, melancholy, and general malaise. This led to what we can only describe as a Victorian supply chain problem. With doctors' hands cramping and schedules overbooked, inventors raced to create mechanized solutions. Thus emerged the earliest personal use vibrators, bulky brass and wood contraptions, powered by cranks, steam, or even foot pedals, all designed to bring the cure home. One model, the Chattanooga vibrator, resembled a table-mounted sewing machine, ideal for the parlor or fainting room, as long as you didn't mind your curtains fluttering from the motor. Another, the Granville hammer, looked like a tiny jackhammer and was said to stimulate subcutaneous nerve fields, read pelvic tension. These devices were marketed in catalogues with phrases like rejuvenates feminine strength, combats uterine fatigue, provides gentle relief from nervous burdens. Translation: you're stressed and bored, and no one's letting you ride a horse, plug this in. To be clear, not every woman who used these machines was fooled. Some almost certainly understood the true nature of the treatment, even if they couldn't say it out loud in mixed company. But many genuinely believed they were undergoing a medical procedure. Why? Because the medical system told them so. Because society told them their bodies were mysterious machines prone to malfunction. Because emotions were symptoms, and desire was a diagnosis. And beyond the treatment itself, these devices reflected something deeper, how Victorian gender roles were hardwired into the design of medical technology. Men's ailments were treated with gadgets that implied strength, vigor, or restoration of power. Women's devices, by contrast, were coded with softness, modesty, and a need to be soothed. Male-targeted devices zapped, buzzed, and charged. Female-targeted machines massaged, vibrated, and soothed the nerves. Even the advertisements leaned into delicate language. Illustrations showed women reclining gracefully, one hand to their forehead, while the machine worked out her unruly uterus like a stubborn knot in a gentleman's cravat. And then there were the side effects, or rather, the complete lack of discussion about them. Most of these devices were designed without any real understanding of anatomy or safety. Some caused burns, bruising, or nerve irritation. But when women complained, the blame often fell back on what else? Their delicate constitutions. If the treatment didn't work, it was because the patient had insufficient nerve response or a willful womb. That's right, even the uterus was considered disobedient. Side effects may include calmness, fainting, and spontaneous knitting. By the end of the century, vibratory devices had become so common that they started appearing in Sears catalogues right next to waffle irons and tea sets. The manufacturers still maintained the medical facade, even as more people began to suspect that pelvic stimulation for nervous disorders was just Victorian speak for "I needed a break from my 11 children, and this does the trick." Eventually, as modern medicine advanced, the diagnosis of female hysteria fell out of favor. Doctors began to realize that emotions were not illnesses, and that maybe, just maybe, women didn't need to be mechanically calmed every time they had a feeling. Still, these devices and the thinking behind them had a lasting legacy. They showed how medicine can be shaped not just by science, but by social assumptions, gender bias, and the desperate need to make the confusing seem treatable. And if that meant plugging a woman into a steampunk symphony machine and calling it uterine revitalization, well, that was just good, clean Victorian science. If the Victorians had one unshakable belief, it was that electricity could cure everything, if not by zapping it, then by bottling it, drinking it, rubbing it on your forehead, and possibly gargling it before bed, because after a century of strapping batteries to their bodies and vibrating their way to inner calm, they found a new, even stranger frontier, consuming electricity itself. Yes, welcome to the electrified age of sparkling pseudoscience, where lightning was something you could buy in a bottle, pills buzzed with invisible currents, and patent medicine hawkers swore that you could drink your way to enlightenment, one thunderous sip at a time. By the late 1800s, bottled water wasn't just for hydration, it was for recalibrating your personal frequency. Enter the trend of electrified or magnetized water. These bottles, sold under names like Vital Elixir, Galvano Aqua, or the unforgettable Dr. Hinton's charged etheric fluid, promised to deliver the invigorating benefits of electricity in a form you could chug before breakfast. The marketing was impressive. Labels boasted claims such as infused with galvanic force, positively polarized for full body realignment, bottled under the guidance of electromagnetic harmonics. What was actually inside these miracle tonics? Mostly tap water, occasionally with trace minerals, and often with a very questionable amount of alcohol. Some also contained mild acids or alkaline salts to make the water tingle on the tongue. A trick to simulate the idea that your taste buds were being stimulated by positive energy. In some cases, these bottles were actually packaged with little metal rods inside, designed to store electricity or channel cosmic currents into the liquid. That's right, Victorian water bottles with accessories. Never mind that electricity doesn't really sit around waiting to be sipped like tea. It made people feel fancy, modern, and slightly buzzed, either from belief or brandy content. One particularly bold advertisement claimed that drinking electrified water restored the sparkle of the eyes, the spring of the step, and the dignity of the liver. Frankly, we're still not sure what a dignified liver looks like. Not to be outdone by the drinkable lightning crowd, pill manufacturers leapt onto the bandwagon with electric pills, vibratory lozenges, and electrotonic tablets, all of which sounded thrillingly futuristic and were almost entirely made of baking soda, chalk, or crushed herbs. But the key was branding. Pill bottles often featured lightning bolts, copper coil graphics, or names like Voltoids or Dr. Magnum's electromercuric digestives. Some claim to contain vibrational energy harvested from lodestones or ether-charged quartz. Others promised to deliver nerve activation through ionic infusion, which is fancy talk for we put a rock in the bottle and blessed it with science-y words. Some of these pills fizzed when dissolved in water again, a clever gimmick to make users think something electric was happening. One bestseller, called Electro Boost Pellets, promised to invigorate the spleen and realign internal magnetism. Translation: mild caffeine plus wishful thinking. But to be fair, the placebo effect was powerful. People reported feeling charged, energized, or strangely lightheaded, which could have been from the supposed vibrational energy, or simply from the fact that they were finally drinking more than one glass of water a week. For those who preferred to breathe their electricity, there were devices marketed to ionize the air around your bed. These weren't air purifiers in the modern sense. They were more like steampunk humidifiers crossed with Frankenstein's desk lamp. Some consisted of a glass globe with metal coils inside, powered by a hand crank or dry cell battery. Once turned on, the device would emit a low hum and sometimes a faint blue glow, features that were supposed to signal ionization but were more likely just a sign that the wires were about to overheat. Ads promised that sleeping beside one would enhance dream clarity, synchronize subconscious rhythms, and even prevent morning melancholia. In reality, You were just sleeping next to a buzzing electrical egg that may or may not have been leaking ozone into your boudoir. Still, it felt like progress. If you weren't drinking your electricity or popping it like candy, at least you could inhale it romantically in your sleep. All of these products, liquids, pills, and ionizers, fell under the booming and barely regulated umbrella of patent. These were over-the-counter remedies that didn't require prescriptions and weren't subjected to modern safety testing. You could slap the word electric on anything from toothpaste to beef extract and triple your sales overnight. In some cases, companies didn't even bother with real devices. They sold electric aura cards, little slips of paper printed with metallic ink and supposedly infused with psychic voltage. You were instructed to wear one inside your pocket, near your heart, to conduct harmonious vibrations into the bloodstream. Side effect: looking like you were collecting coupons for a seance. There were even electro-charged face creams made with iron filings, advertised as wrinkle removers and cheek tighteners. In practice, they were just gritty goop in pretty jars that made your skin tingle slightly and your laundry very sad. But the crown jewel of absurdity may have been the lightning liver lifter, a tonic containing dubious herbs, a lot of alcohol, and a copper token taped to the bottle for vibrational resonance. Yes, you could get drunk and pretend your liver was singing in a higher frequency, because nothing says health like sipping thunder. The electric medicine craze wasn't just about bad science, it was about hope, modernity, and desperation in a bottle. People wanted to feel like they were part of something futuristic, something beyond the leeches and mustard plasters of yesteryear. Electricity was mysterious, glamorous, and just dangerous enough to feel legitimate. Of course, none of these products were truly electric in the way their sellers claimed, but they delivered something even more powerful: the illusion of control over your health, neatly packaged in glowing, humming, wonderfully ridiculous form. Next up, how the glow finally dimmed, the crackles faded, and the world slowly began to trade voltage for reason. By the dawn of the 20th century, Victorian society had finally started to take a collective look at itself and ask, have we possibly electrocuted ourselves enough? After nearly a century of buzzing belts, zapping corsets, vibrating water, and gadgets that promised to realign your aura, something strange happened. People stopped believing. The sparks didn't vanish overnight, of course, but the voltage mania that once dominated health trends, catalogue ads, and parlor room gossip began to quietly fizzle out like a forgotten hand-cranked hairbrush. And the reason was simple: real science finally caught up, and the world had much bigger things to worry about than vibrating spleens. By the early 1900s, the medical profession had gone through a much-needed glow-up. Doctors were no longer just bearded men waving electrodes like magic wands. Thanks to advances in microbiology, chemistry, and diagnostics, germ theory replaced miasma, microscopes became mainstream, and aspirin began to edge out arsenic as the preferred remedy for everything short of heartbreak. Electricity didn't vanish from medicine, it matured. Instead of being blasted into your eardrum by a well-dressed quack in a waistcoat, electricity became something serious, something measured, something that required actual training. This was the age of the electrocardiogram (EKG), which could record the faint electrical signals of the human heart. In hospitals, scientists began using X-rays, discovering ways to peer inside the body using electromagnetic waves, no vibrating water required. Later, technologies like defibrillators and neurological stimulation devices proved that electricity really could save lives if you stopped trying to shove it into people's belly buttons and started reading a textbook. And perhaps nothing dealt a stronger shock to quackery than the arrival of World War I. Suddenly, societies were dealing with mass injuries, amputations, and conditions like shell shock that no amount of vibratory lotion could solve. Medicine became urgent, industrial, and deeply serious. The battlefield didn't have room for whimsical belly chargers or ether-charged face creams. The snake oil salesmen were finally outpaced by surgeons and scientists. Some were quietly tossed in drawers and forgotten. Others found new lives in antique shops or, weirdly, as conversation starters in very awkward drawing rooms. Oh yes, great-grandmother used to swear by her vibrating saddle. No, we don't use it anymore, please stop touching it. Some were simply rebranded. As medical regulation tightened, manufacturers pivoted from cure for all ills to gentler claims like promotes well-being or aids relaxation. A few companies even marketed their gadgets as vintage exercise aids, which is a fancy way of saying fancy paperweights with wires. And yet, something lingered, even as Victorian voltage therapy died off. The idea that electricity or vibrational energy or magnetic resonance or biofrequency alignment could somehow fix our flawed little human bodies, that idea refused to die. Because let's be honest, we're still doing it. Just swap out the corset buzzers for magnetic bracelets, crystal-charged water bottles, or $400 vibrating facial wands that promise to tone your energy field. The aesthetic is sleeker now, more Apple Store than gaslit apothecary, but the pitch hasn't changed all that much. This smart patch reboots your nervous system. This device clears negative frequencies using sound and light. This mattress uses ion technology to help you dream better. Sound familiar? Heck, we now have smartwatches that buzz on our wrists, reminding us to breathe, stand, or reconnect with our center. They may not claim to cure hysteria yet, but they sure know how to trigger mild panic when your heart rate spikes after climbing stairs. Victorians shocked themselves silly. We just pay $300 for a smartwatch that tells us to breathe. So in a way, the legacy of Victorian electrofads lives on, not in the wires and batteries, but in the eternal human desire to hack our health with gadgets, preferably ones that buzz, blink, or glow faintly in the dark. The story of Victorian electrotherapy isn't just about bad science or weird devices. It's a story about curiosity, desperation, and a sincere belief in the future. These were people trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world. Electricity was the most exciting thing they'd ever seen. It powered lamps, ran trains, and lit up city streets. Of course they thought it could light up their spleens too, and yes, they got it wrong in spectacular, often hilarious ways, but they also paved the way for the real science that followed. For every bogus belt and sizzling tongue rod, there was a lesson learned. Eventually, because progress is rarely a straight line, sometimes it zigzags through a vibrating mustache comb and an electrified corset before arriving at something useful. So next time you strap on a wearable that tracks your stress levels or sit on a chair that stimulates your spine using microcurrents, take a moment to thank your ancestors in top hats and crinolines. They walked so your wellness tech could vibrate, and they did it while mildly on fire. Let's talk about Tycho Brahe, the noseless astronomer who turned science into a soap opera. Picture it. December 14, 1546. The Danish nobility is doing what nobles do, fencing, feasting, and fretting about land, lineage, and whether their tunics are embroidered enough to intimidate their neighbors. Into this frosty northern aristocratic stew is born Tycho Ottoson Brahe. You'll know him as Tycho, because honestly, Tycho sounds like a Viking typo, and from the moment he drew breath, it was clear this baby was not going to do things the normal way. First of all, he was a twin, but not the surviving one. His twin brother was gone shortly after birth, a fact that would have made most Renaissance families break out the black lace and somber poetry. But the Brahes, they had bigger problems. See, Tycho's birth was the result of some high-stakes noble family scheming. His parents, Otto Brahe and Bete Bille, were Danish blue bloods, the kind of people who could trace their ancestry back to kings, conquerors, and probably a few people who owned disturbingly large suits of armor. But Otto had a brother named Jørgen Brahe, and Jørgen was childless. Now, in modern terms, being childless just means fewer toys to step on. But in 16th century Denmark, it was a serious legacy crisis. So as the story goes, Jørgen casually adopted baby Tycho, as in, just took him, with or without permission. Historians argue over the details, but the bros apparently reached an agreement that went something like, sure, you can take one of the kids, just bring him back if he starts dueling people over algebra. Jørgen didn't just raise Tycho, He raised him right into his own world of court life, politics, and absolutely none of the things Tycho would eventually care about. From a young age, Tycho was expected to follow the noble path, ride horses, carry swords, and learn how to scowl dramatically while wearing fur. Science, math, astronomy, those were considered decent hobbies at best, not real careers. In the 1500s, the only stars that mattered were royal ones, not celestial bodies floating millions of miles away. But Tycho had other plans. When he was around 13, a solar eclipse darkened the skies, and unlike most children who might hide under the table or write a spooky poem about it, Tycho had a full-blown epiphany. The heavens moved, the sky changed, and no one around him seemed to know why or even care. That was enough to light the fire. From that moment on, Tycho wasn't just interested in the stars, he was obsessed. It wasn't a phase, it was the Renaissance equivalent of a middle schooler deciding to become Batman and actually succeeding. Naturally, his family tried to steer him in a more respectable direction. They sent him to university at just 12 years old, which wasn't that weird for noble boys back then, but still puts the rest of us to shame. He was meant to study law, as in paperwork, statutes, and being a disappointment to curious minds everywhere. But while his professors droned on about legal precedent, Tycho was sneaking off to learn astronomy behind their backs, buying books and instruments with his allowance like a rebellious nerd. This wasn't your average academic rebellion. Tycho wasn't playing with sundials or writing moody star poems. He was manually calculating planetary orbits using instruments made from whatever he could find. He also started writing astrological predictions because in the 16th century, astrology and astronomy were still having a messy divorce, and no one was sure who was getting custody of credibility. And because Tycho couldn't just be a young astronomy prodigy, he had to look the part too. Even in his teenage years, he started dressing with an extravagant flair, rich fabrics, embroidered cloaks, and later in life that infamous metal nose. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. In a time when the average man was lucky to have clean socks, Tycho was out here looking like an alchemy-themed rock star. All of this was happening in a Denmark that wasn't exactly begging for star charts. This was a kingdom entrenched in politics, Protestantism, and powerful noble houses who mostly cared about who owned what land and who had insulted whose hat feathers at court. Scientific curiosity was not on the menu. In many ways, Tycho Brahe was a man completely out of sync with his time, a Renaissance rebel with a pocket full of star maps, an aristocratic ego, and just enough defiance to chart a new course for astronomy. So yes, Tycho Brahe was born into nobility, but from the very beginning, he made it clear that the stars held more sway over him than kings ever would. While other boys played sword games in the courtyard, Tycho was calculating the mechanics of a lunar eclipse, probably while dramatically silhouetted by candlelight. His life wasn't just destined for greatness, it was destined for drama, glitter, and orbital eccentricity. There are many ways to express intellectual disagreement. Some people write essays, some people debate, and then there's Tycho Brahe, who, in the grand Renaissance tradition of everything is better with violence, decided to settle an academic squabble with a sword fight over a math problem. Yes, in a time when students carried swords the way modern freshmen carry Red Bull, Tycho turned a disagreement about planetary calculations into an impromptu fencing match. It was 1566, and our teenage astronomical overachiever was studying at the University of Rostock in what is now Germany. Rostock was your classic 16th century college town, cold, boozy, and full of bored young noblemen looking for reasons to swing sharp objects at each other. Now, Tycho wasn't just a student, he was a Brahe. That meant noble blood, ridiculous wealth, and the swagger of a man who could afford velvet breeches lined with ego. He strutted through academic halls in fine fabrics, debating astronomy and astrology with such theatrical intensity, you'd think he was auditioning for the role of most dramatic astronomer alive, and in fairness, he got the part. Enter Manderup Parsberg, a fellow Danish nobleman and student. The two were classmates, drinking buddies, and for a time intellectual peers. But something happened, a math disagreement. Historians are frustratingly vague about the actual subject of the dispute, but it was likely about whose astronomical tables were more accurate, or who should take credit for a celestial prediction. In any case, it escalated very quickly. Now, in our modern world, if two students fought over an algebra answer, the worst outcome might be a failed group project. But in Renaissance Europe, honor was a currency you protected with cold steel. So on a dark December night, Tycho and Passberg met by moonlight and decided to sword fight the numbers into submission. It did not go well for Tycho's face. At some point during the duel, possibly during a particularly dramatic lunge or a miscalculation of blade angles, Passberg slashed Tycho across the bridge of his nose, leaving him permanently disfigured. In most cases, this would have led to an unremarkable life of wearing large hats and avoiding mirrors. But this was Tycho Brahe. Rather than hide the damage, Tycho doubled down on the drama. He decided that the best solution to a missing chunk of nose was not shame or humility, but a handcrafted metal prosthetic. According to historical sources, he created a metal nosepiece to wear over the ruined part of his face, held in place with some kind of glue or paste, because Renaissance science hadn't quite reached the era of convenient nose magnets. Now, here's where things get mysterious. Some stories say the nose was made of gold. Others insist it was brass, or even copper. And yet, when Tycho's body was exhumed in the 20th century for scientific study, yes, scientists dug him up centuries later because he was still just that interesting. Tests showed traces of copper and zinc, suggesting a brass alloy, which is hilarious when you realize he might have spent his entire life pretending his nose was gold, when it was actually more trumpet chic. Regardless of the material, what mattered most was the look. Tycho didn't just wear a prosthetic nose, he owned it. He leaned into his new metal face with Renaissance-level flair. Where others saw injury, Tycho saw an opportunity to literally shine in candlelight. He customized his outfits to complement his new nose, donning rich silks, embroidered cloaks, and meticulously styled beards that framed his gleaming face like a portrait of astronomical swagger. He was no longer just Tycho Brahe, he was Tycho Brahe, the metal-nosed nobleman who studied the stars and fenced over fractions. There was an undeniable theatricality to it all. He didn't just do science, he performed it. He wasn't about quiet contemplation under the stars, he was about pointing at them dramatically while looking like a lunar eclipse in velvet. And people noticed. His appearance, already eccentric before the nose incident, now became iconic. There's something timeless about a man who gets slashed in the face and responds not with retreat, but with prosthetics and pizzazz. He turned injury into identity, and in doing so cemented his place as the Renaissance's most memorable scientific drama queen. But the duel wasn't just a fashion catalyst. It marked a turning point in Tycho's life. He didn't retreat from academia or become cautious after being disfigured. He became bolder. He traveled more, studied harder, observed the skies longer. The world had taken a piece of his face, and he responded by trying to map the heavens more perfectly than anyone ever had. That duel was ridiculous, unnecessary, and 100% on brand for a man whose ego was rivaled only by his astronomical curiosity. And in the long, winding story of Tycho Brahe, losing his nose might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. After all, how many scientists can say their career took off because of a math-fueled blade fight? So, let's say you're a Renaissance nobleman with a brass nose, a petty grudge against every rival astronomer alive, and the world's largest collection of pre-telescope sky data. What do you do next? Easy. You convince the king to build you a private science palace on an island. In the 1570s, Tycho Brahe was on a hot streak. Despite the minor inconvenience of being literally part metal, he had gained a serious reputation, the astronomer who got results. He was charting the stars like no one else in Europe, obsessively recording planetary positions, comets, and celestial weirdness, with a level of precision that made most other scientists look like they were guessing with a stick and some string. But Brahe was never content with working from some dusty university observatory. Oh no, he had a vision. a utopia of science, a Renaissance research compound where he could chase knowledge in comfort, away from the noise of cities and the even noisier opinions of other scientists. Enter King Frederick II of Denmark. Frederick was no slouch himself, powerful, clever, and just cultured enough to know that patronizing science made you look sophisticated, especially if the scientist in question was Tycho Brahe, the man making Denmark look like the intellectual capital of the North. Tycho, using his noble connections and undeniable charisma, an ego that could bend light, pitched the king on an idea so absurdly grand that it shouldn't have worked. It did. In 1576, Frederick granted Tycho the island of Heaven, located in the Øresund Strait between Denmark and Sweden. He also threw in generous funding, noble privileges, and basically said, "Here's an island, build your science dream house. Just keep the star charts coming." And oh, did Tycho deliver. The result was Uraniborg, named for Urania, the muse of astronomy. But don't let the poetic name fool you. Uraniborg wasn't just a building, it was Tycho's personal Hogwarts, a Renaissance Bond villain lair, reimagined for astronomy and occasional deer petting. Construction began immediately. Tycho personally oversaw every inch of it, from the layout of the buildings to the celestial-themed wallpapers. The centerpiece was the observatory itself, a square Renaissance-style castle decked out with towers, domes, and astronomical flair. But that was just the start. Inside, Uraniborg featured observation rooms with precision instruments larger than furniture, alchemy labs, because no good Renaissance mansion was complete without attempts to turn things into gold. A private printing press, so Tycho could publish his findings and also his enemies' mistakes. Living quarters for assistants, many of whom spent their nights charting the sky and wondering why they hadn't gone into banking. And then there was the deer park, because Tycho, despite being a data-obsessed genius, also had a flair for the eccentric. The grounds of Uraniborg included manicured gardens, exotic herbs for experiments, and actual deer wandering around like confused mascots. It was part observatory, part luxury villa, part live-action nature documentary, but perhaps the most stunning thing about Uraniborg was that all of this was done without telescopes. Remember, Tycho lived before Galileo pointed a lens at the moon, so how did he make his observations? The answer: monumental instruments. Tycho designed and commissioned giant astronomical tools, quadrants, sextants, and armillary spheres that could measure the position of celestial bodies to within a fraction of a degree. These things were massive. Some were mounted in underground rooms to avoid wind interference. They looked like giant weaponized compasses, ready to either measure Mars or defend the island from pirates. These instruments weren't just functional, they were art. Brass, wood, engraved dials, intricate armatures. Tycho wasn't just taking notes, he was staging a celestial theater. Observations became rituals. Assistants would labor through the night, adjusting huge devices by torchlight, as Tycho dictated numbers and corrected them with his usual mix of brilliance and bluster. And because Uraniborg was also a publishing house, Tycho could print and distribute his data faster than anyone else in Europe. This gave him immense scientific clout, and also let him settle scientific beefs with the Renaissance equivalent of subtweets. You didn't just argue with Tycho, you found yourself cited, corrected, and published against in a book printed from his personal island fortress. Socially, Uraniborg became a hub. Nobles, scholars, and the curious elite would visit the island to see Tycho at work and be treated to a tour that likely included star maps, political gossip, and possibly a drunken elk. More on that in the next chapter. For Tycho, this wasn't just research, it was performance art, science, but with flair. In the end, Uraniborg was a monument to what happens when genius, ego, and royal funding collide. It was an observatory, it was a laboratory, it was a Renaissance celebrity's private island where the stars were always in season, and the deer were usually tipsy. If there had been Renaissance place to stay, the listing would have read, "Private Island Getaway for Noble Astronomers. Features celestial instruments, luxurious gardens, nighttime data collection, And surprise alchemical explosions. Host has a metal nose and strong opinions. 5 stars, all of them charted precisely. Imagine being invited to dinner at a world-renowned scientific estate, nestled on a private island, surrounded by the greatest astronomical instruments of the age. You arrive expecting philosophical discussions, refined manners, maybe a polite game of chess. Instead, you're greeted by a slightly drunk elk, a nobleman with a metal nose, and an assistant who may or may not be reading your mind across the table. Welcome to dinner at Tycho Brahe's Uraniborg, where science met chaos, and the horoscopes hit harder than the wine. Let's begin with the elk. Yes, Tycho Brahe kept an elk, as in the giant forest-dwelling creature that looks like a deer who lifted weights. According to letters written by visitors, this wasn't some distant creature kept in a pen for decoration. Tycho's elk was a full-fledged member of the household. It roamed the grounds, wandered through halls, and most memorably joined in at banquets. Why? Because Tycho, being Tycho, believed in blending brilliance with the bizarre. Some say the elk was a sort of living joke. Others suggest it was a status symbol. After all, if you're a nobleman with your own observatory, why not throw in a horned party crasher? The elk, naturally, became a legend. Visitors wrote of how it would loiter near the feast table and drink beer with the guests, a detail no one ever questioned, because apparently that was just standard elk etiquette at Uraniborg. Tragically, one night during a particularly rowdy feast at a nobleman's estate, not even Tycho's, the elk allegedly got drunk, tried to navigate a staircase and died from the fall. You read that correctly. Tycho's elk died in a beer-fueled stairwell incident, and honestly, that sets the tone for the entire Uraniborg social scene. Because Tycho didn't just study the stars, he hosted them. His dinners were legendary, long, luxurious, and often laced with wine, music, and a sprinkle of passive-aggressive astrology. Attendees included scholars, nobles, foreign dignitaries, and the occasional confused monk. And seated at the table, in a place of honor, usually opposite the elk, was Jeppe. Now, Jeppe, full name possibly Jeppe of Heaven, was Tycho's court jester, assistant, and possibly unlicensed spiritual advisor. Described in various accounts as a little person with a sharp tongue and sharper wit, Jeppe became one of the most memorable figures in the Brahe household. Some guests believed he could see the future, or at least guess it with unnerving accuracy. He was often seen sitting quietly under the table during meals, only to pop up with a sarcastic comment or an unsolicited critique of someone's planetary alignment. One nobleman swore that Jeppe predicted his engagement would fail, and it did, possibly because his fiancée didn't appreciate getting roasted by Tycho's under-the-table oracle. But psychic powers aside, Jeppe was something of a Renaissance iconoclast. He spoke his mind, insulted the rich, and held a mirror up to the pomp of the nobility with a cheeky grin and a raised goblet. He was the anti-hype man of Uraniborg, part jester, part genius, part chaos gremlin, and Tycho loved it. Their dynamic was strange but deeply loyal. Tycho, despite being a famously egotistical man, seemed to respect Jeppe's role as both foil and friend. The two shared a bizarre camaraderie, like a mismatched buddy comedy where one charts the stars and the other heckles the constellations. Of course, the real entertainment came from Tycho himself. Dinner wasn't just about eating, it was about performing science through small talk. Between bites of roasted game and sips of expensive wine, Tycho would launch into philosophical debates. What influenced the stars? Was astrology nonsense or divine truth? How would your birth chart explain why you couldn't hold your wine? If you thought you could quietly enjoy a leg of venison at Tycho's table, think again. He was known to cast horoscopes for his guests during the meal, casually announcing things like, "Mars is in retrograde, which explains why your forehead is so shiny tonight, Lord Frederick." The mood swung wildly between intellectual wonder and wine-fueled absurdity. One minute you'd be discussing the elliptical paths of heavenly bodies, and the next you'd be dodging the actual body of an elk trying to sit next to you. But that's what made Uraniborg unforgettable. It wasn't just a house of science, it was a living, breathing Renaissance soap opera with a celestial twist. Visitors walked away with star charts, bruised egos, hangovers, and sometimes a mysterious fear of under-the-table prophecy. In short, dinner with Tycho meant debating the cosmos, dodging antlers, and hoping Jeppy didn't insult your horoscope in rhyme. And through it all, Tycho thrived, not in spite of the chaos, but because of it. His household was a reflection of his mind, brilliant, messy, theatrical, and orbiting somewhere between science and spectacle. Uraniborg wasn't a quiet observatory. It was a Renaissance variety show run by a man with a prosthetic nose and a flair for drama, and the elk was just the opening act. Tycho Brahe had a lot of strong opinions. On the heavens, on fashion, on dinner guests who didn't know their rising sign. But few opinions burned as brightly or as stubbornly as his refusal to accept that the Earth moved. Planets could do a little dance. The Sun? Maybe. But the Earth? Absolutely not. Thank you very much. In an age when people were starting to whisper dangerous things like, what if we're not the center of the universe? As Tycho Brahe doubled down and essentially shouted back, we are, and we look fabulous. Let's be clear, Tycho was no fool. He wasn't some backwards old man yelling at comets. He was a genius, and the sheer scale of what he accomplished would take several nervous breakdowns and 2 Red Bulls for anyone else to attempt. He gathered more precise astronomical data than anyone in the world before the telescope was even invented. That alone should earn him a statue, preferably one with a removable nose for seasonal accessorizing. But when it came to the structure of the cosmos, Tycho found himself in a celestial tug-of-war. On one side you had the old-school Ptolemy and his geocentric model, with Earth at the center and the sun, moon and stars doing figure-8s around us like drunk fireflies. This was the safe bet, the church-approved model, the no-one-will-arrest-you option. On the other side, Copernicus had just dropped the heliocentric mic, daring to suggest that Earth wasn't the center of anything. In this new model, the sun was in the middle, and we were just one of the backup dancers in a much larger cosmic choreography. Tycho did not like this, not because he was closed-minded, but because he had data and lots of it. Mountains of observations recorded by eye and by hand every single night, in painstaking detail, no telescope, just Tycho, his assistants, and instruments that were one misstep away from being catapults. And from all this data, Tycho noticed something weird. If the Earth really was moving around the sun, shouldn't he be able to detect it? He looked for stellar parallax, the way stars should shift position slightly as the Earth moved, and he couldn't see it. Spoiler, it was there, just too tiny for even Tycho's massive instruments to detect without a telescope. But Tycho didn't have the benefit of hindsight. All he had was his perfectly measured, star-strewn notebooks, and a burning belief that if he couldn't see the shift, it didn't exist. So, like any good Renaissance mad genius, he invented a whole new model of the universe to make everyone happy and no one happy at the same time. Behold, the Tychonic system. Imagine the cosmic equivalent of a diplomatic compromise written during a thunderstorm. In Tycho's model, Earth sits at the center, the sun and moon orbit the Earth, but all the other planets orbit the sun, which is itself doing donuts around the Earth. It was a geocentric-heliocentric fusion, the chicken and beef burrito of astronomy. Tycho pitched it as the best of both worlds. It preserved the Earth's central position, great for religious folks, but also explained planetary motion with less mathematical gymnastics than Ptolemy's older model. And to be fair, it kind of worked. For decades, Tycho's model became a go-to option for people who liked science, but didn't want to be burned at the stake. It was clean, predictive, and looked great on a fresco. But not everyone loved it, especially not other astronomers. Some saw him as regressive, others thought he was trying to have his celestial cake and orbit it too. This led to beefs with multiple scientists, some of whom Tycho cheerfully called out in his publications by name. Yes, he actually published burn books. If someone criticized his model, he'd slap their name on a page and proceed to destroy them with footnotes and savage Latin prose. His scientific arguments read like academic diss tracks. Oh really, Johannes? Your numbers are impressive for someone who apparently took them from a goat. Tycho didn't mind losing friends. He minded being wrong, or worse, being ignored. And so, as Copernican ideas gained traction, Tycho dug in deeper. He refused to yield to theories that didn't match his data, even if the data was missing a few pixels due to technological limits. Ironically, the very data Tycho collected in defense of his Earth-centered beliefs would become the foundation for heliocentric truth. His assistant, a certain Johannes Kepler, would later use those numbers to show that planets didn't just orbit the sun, they did so in ellipses, not circles. But that's a future feud. For now, Tycho stood alone on his science island, surrounded by brass instruments, celestial charts, and enemies who were increasingly reluctant to show up for dinner. He might not have moved the Earth, but he moved the conversation, kicking astronomy into a new orbit where precision mattered more than dogma. Every great hero needs a sidekick, or a nemesis, or, in Tycho Brahe's case, a brilliant but perpetually annoyed assistant who had zero interest in pet deer and even less patience for data gatekeeping. By the late 1590s, Tycho's personal universe had wobbled off its axis. His beloved observatory Uraniborg was no longer his. The new Danish king, Christian IV, had all the enthusiasm of a brick when it came to funding flamboyant astronomers with alchemical gardens. Christian/Tycho's royal pension questioned his noble privileges and politely encouraged him to leave the kingdom before he started writing angry horoscopes in the margins of official documents. So Tycho did what any exiled Renaissance scientist would do. He packed up his massive brass instruments and moved to Prague, the glittering, weirdly mystical capital of the Holy Roman Empire. There, Emperor Rudolf II, a man with an official court magician and a fondness for horoscopes that could double as personality quizzes, welcomed Tycho like a long-lost wizard uncle. He gave him a new title, new funding, and a cushy job as imperial mathematician. But if Tycho was to truly secure his scientific legacy, he needed more than royal titles. He needed someone with the mathematical firepower to turn his vast oceans of observational data into something revolutionary. Enter Johannes Kepler. If Tycho was a flaming meteor of theatrical energy, Kepler was a smoldering ball of mathematical intensity. He'd grown up poor in the German state of Württemberg, suffered through a childhood that included illness, religious tension, and the occasional witch trial. His own mother was accused, and had somehow emerged with a brain full of orbits and a heart full of theological equations. Kepler believed that the cosmos was built on divine geometry. He saw math not just as a tool, but as a way to read God's handwriting in the stars. And he was desperate, absolutely desperate for Tycho's data. Because while Kepler had ideas, he had no way to test them. The numbers didn't lie. And Tycho had all of them. Unfortunately, Tycho also had trust issues the size of a comet's tail. From the moment Kepler arrived in 1600, their relationship was tense. Tycho recognized Kepler's talent, sure, but he also saw him as a potential credit stealer, a data thief, and perhaps worst of all, a man who didn't believe in the Tychonic system. You know, the model Tycho had invented to make himself scientifically immortal? That one. Tycho wanted to control the narrative. Kepler just wanted the raw numbers, and so began the ultimate passive-aggressive Renaissance bromance. For months, Kepler hovered on the edge of a cosmic breakthrough, while Tycho guarded his datasets like they were ancient scrolls of divine prophecy, and in a way they kind of were. But the tension wasn't just academic. Their personalities clashed like planetary bodies on a collision course. Tycho was loud, fond of long banquets, and had a taste for extravagance that extended to both his wardrobe and his worldview. Kepler was precise, intense, and emotionally wound tighter than an astrolabe in a thunderstorm. They argued a lot about methods, about models, about whether or not the heavens were built with perfect circles. Kepler said no. Tycho scowled so hard his brass nose nearly popped off. But beneath all that friction was a strange, grudging respect. Tycho may have found Kepler exhausting, but he also saw in him the future of astronomy, a man who could take the Brahean mountain of data and turn it into something eternal. And Kepler? For all his frustration, he couldn't help but be dazzled by Tycho's precision. Tycho had spent decades staring at the sky, night after night, measuring and recording with the kind of obsessiveness usually reserved for royal genealogies and fantasy football statistics. Together they formed one of history's most important and most dysfunctional scientific partnerships. Tycho had the data, Kepler had the math, and both of them had egos big enough to blot out the sun. Tragically, just as their collaboration was finally starting to warm up, Tycho's health took a turn. In 1601, after a banquet in Prague, because of course, he developed a urinary blockage that quickly turned fatal. Ever the nobleman, Tycho refused to leave the dinner table for hours, supposedly because it was impolite to excuse oneself at such a formal affair. Let that sink in. He literally passes away from holding in his excuse out of politeness. With Tycho gone, the baton passed to Kepler. At last, Kepler had full access to the data and no one left to lock the drawers. Over the next few years, he would use Tycho's records to formulate the laws of planetary motion, proving that planets move in elliptical orbits, not circles. It was a scientific revolution Tycho never lived to see, but one he had unintentionally made possible. So while they may have argued, schemed, and side-eyed each other across candle-lit tables, Tycho and Kepler changed the universe together. For a man who spent his life unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos, it's both poetic and painfully ironic that Tycho Brahe's own pass away became one of the biggest mysteries in scientific history. Was it illness? Was it poison? Was it somehow related to his prosthetic nose? Let's start with the official version. Tycho Brahe passed away in October 1601, just shy of his 55th birthday. He was at a formal banquet in Prague, a grand affair held by a nobleman, where in true Renaissance fashion, food was endless, the wine was flowing and no one dared leave the table until the host gave permission. These weren't your average dinner parties, they were multi-hour affairs, fueled by etiquette, social maneuvering and roast animals the size of sleds. And Tycho, being a nobleman to the end, reportedly refused to excuse himself to urinate, believing it would be both rude and dishonorable to leave during such an occasion. So he held it, for hours. According to multiple sources, he began experiencing intense abdominal pain later that evening. Over the next few days the pain worsened. He could not urinate at all. Fever set in. His speech slurred. Then, on October 24, 1601, Tycho Brahe died. The doctors at the time believed he had suffered a burst bladder or kidney failure, a common enough fate in an age without antibiotics or the concept of, hey, maybe get up and go to the bathroom. As far as Renaissance deaths go, it was embarrassing but believable. The man who charted the heavens down to the arcsecond had been defeated by social manners and an uncooperative urethra. But then, things got weird. Because this wasn't just any man. This was Tycho Brahe. And where Tycho went, drama followed, even into the afterlife. Centuries later, questions began to bubble up from the scientific community. Tycho's death had been so sudden, so severe, and most suspiciously so poorly documented, that some historians began to wonder, was it really just a tragic urinary episode, or was something more sinister at play? There was no shortage of theories. Some pointed fingers at none other than Johannes Kepler. After all, he had the motive. Tycho was famously protective of his astronomical data, and Kepler had spent months begging for access. Could Kepler have grown tired of playing second fiddle and second observer? Did he, perhaps, accelerate his promotion to imperial mathematician by slipping something into Tycho's wine? This theory gained traction partly because, after Tycho's death, Kepler gained full control of his mentor's vast observational records, the very data he would later use to crack open the laws of planetary motion. But while dramatic, this theory has some problems, namely, Kepler was many things: obsessive, neurotic, terrifyingly brilliant, but there's little concrete evidence that he was also a Renaissance Walter White. He also seemed genuinely grief-stricken at Tycho's death. And let's be honest, if he were that subtle and calculated, he probably wouldn't have spent so much of his life crying in Latin over math. Then came the Mercury angle. In 1996, Tycho's remains were exhumed by a team of Danish and Czech scientists who wanted to test them using modern forensic technology. To everyone's surprise, the tests revealed elevated levels of mercury in his hair and bones. Mercury, of course, is toxic and can cause death if ingested in sufficient amounts. The theory now had legs. Had someone poisoned Tycho slowly with mercury? Or had he accidentally poisoned himself? This was a man who dabbled in alchemy, remember. He ran chemical experiments in his personal laboratories. He handled bizarre substances daily in pursuit of knowledge, or possibly in pursuit of turning lead into gold, because why not? Mercury was a common ingredient in all sorts of Renaissance cures, cosmetics, and questionable science kits. So maybe Tycho had simply exposed himself during one of his late-night potion mixing sessions. After all, this was the same man who thought putting gold leaf near a star chart might help it shine more accurately. Still, the mystery didn't die there. Yes, some people even pointed fingers at Tycho's infamous metal nose. For centuries it was believed that the nose was made of gold or silver. Later analysis during the exhumation revealed it was mostly brass, a mixture of copper and zinc, but the glue used to attach the prosthetic may have contained toxic chemicals, possibly including mercury or other heavy metals. It's not impossible to imagine that decades of skin contact with an old-school glue mixture slowly built up toxins in Tycho's body. So, did his face kill him? Unlikely. But it does add a certain tragic poetry to the idea of a man who refused to look less fabulous, even at the cost of mild metal poisoning. The most probable explanation is still the medical one: a urinary blockage, untreated infection, and sepsis. But the mercury levels remain a scientific curiosity, high enough to raise eyebrows, but not high enough to conclusively scream murder most foul. What's certain is that Tycho's death was exactly what his life demanded: dramatic, mysterious, and filled with rumors. People whispered, historians speculated, and long after the stars he charted had moved on in their orbits, his legacy continued to sparkle with intrigue. After all, Tycho Brahe may have charted the skies with unrelenting precision, but in the end he forgot to schedule a bathroom break. Tycho Brahe may have gone in 1601, possibly of a bladder explosion, mercury, sabotage, or sheer refusal to behave, but his legacy didn't just survive, it refused to shut up. He wasn't just another Renaissance scholar who scribbled in Latin and disappeared into a dusty archive. No, Tycho left the stage of history like a man who had kicked open the theatre doors, rewritten the script, and duct-taped a golden nose to the lead actor. He didn't just leave behind data, he left behind a movement. Let's start with the most famous recipient of his astronomical mountain of numbers, Johannes Kepler. After Tycho's very dramatic exit, Kepler finally got what he'd been begging for: unrestricted access to Tycho's observations, especially his obsessively detailed records of Mars's position. It was this data recorded night after night by Tycho, using instruments the size of ox carts and the precision of a man who may or may not have labeled his stars by SAS level, that allowed Kepler to make a discovery that reshaped the cosmos, namely, planets don't move in perfect circles. For over 1,000 years, everyone from Ptolemy to Copernicus had believed the heavens were built on perfect geometric forms. Circles were divine, neat, clean, but Kepler, using Tycho's far too precise to ignore data, realized that Mars wasn't cooperating. Its orbit was slightly off enough to ruin the perfect circle fantasy. And so, in 1609, Kepler published the first 2 laws of planetary motion, revealing that planets move in elliptical orbits around the Sun. They sweep out equal areas in equal times, meaning their speed varies depending on how close they are to the Sun. These were revolutionary ideas. Tycho didn't live to see them published, but without his lifetime of observations, Kepler wouldn't have had the raw material to find them. In other words, Tycho had the numbers, Kepler had the math. Together they gave birth to modern astronomy, even if the partnership was mostly passive-aggressive sighs and awkward glances across candlelit observatory tables. Beyond Kepler, Tycho's influence reached far beyond any planetary orbit. He pioneered something that was far rarer than gold-plated noses in 16th century science: rigorous, meticulous, obsessive observation. At a time when many astronomers were still relying on inherited models and ancient scrolls, Tycho said, "Nope, let's measure everything again, with better tools, and if it's cloudy, I'll wait, for weeks, maybe months, then I'll measure it again, twice." This level of dedication changed how science was done. Tycho proved that careful data collection down to the tiniest decimal point mattered. That theory without measurement was just intellectual fan fiction. It's no exaggeration to say that Tycho redefined empirical science. Long before telescopes became the norm, he pushed the limits of naked eye observation to their absolute maximum. In fact, his instruments were so well calibrated that astronomers used his data well into the 17th century, even when newer models came along. And let's not forget funding. Tycho was one of the first scientists to successfully convince a king to bankroll not just an observatory, but an entire science island. He framed astronomy as a noble pursuit, worthy of royal support, public admiration, and the occasional pet elk. That legacy of science as a funded, respected endeavor still echoes today in modern research institutions. But numbers and laws aside, Tycho's greatest legacy might be Tycho himself, because he didn't just do science, he performed it. He made astronomy theatrical, dramatic, and sometimes outright ridiculous. He gave it a face, sometimes made of brass but always memorable. He cultivated a persona: the robes, the prosthetic nose, the astrologically themed dinner parties, the elaborate observatories, the castle laboratories, the little person assistant who may have been psychic, the elk that got tipsy and fell down a staircase. All of it was intentional chaos with a purpose. He wanted people to remember, and they did. He blurred the line between science and spectacle, between noble dignity and glorious nerdiness. He wasn't afraid to look strange, so long as it got people to look up at the stars. And for that, Tycho Brahe remains a kind of celestial icon, the brilliant eccentric who taught the world that data mattered, but so did presentation. Even now, centuries later, Tycho lives on in pop culture, in scientific folklore, and in every underpaid graduate student hunched over a spreadsheet muttering, "Well, at least I didn't die from not peeing." Because really, Tycho's greatest lesson wasn't just about astronomy. It was this: you don't need a telescope to change the universe. You just need a brass nose, a drunk elk, and the stubborn courage to measure the stars your own way. Before he was Rome's most notorious lunatic, before he declared war on the ocean, or appointed a horse to government, or possibly styled himself as a walking, talking thunderbolt, Caligula was just a kid with really tiny shoes and a wildly unstable family tree. Born in 12 CE in Antium, modern-day Anzio, Italy, Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus was the youngest son of the Roman golden boy Germanicus, and the sharp-tongued, sharp-witted Agrippina the Elder. It's worth noting that in a family of epic names and bigger egos, Gaius managed to stand out not by politics nor prophecy, but by turning himself into a battlefield mascot. See, his father Germanicus was a rock star general, handsome, popular, beloved by the legions, and rumored to smell faintly of olive oil and destiny. The Roman army adored him, so when Germanicus took his family with him on military campaigns along the Rhine, little Gaius was dressed in a custom-made child-sized soldier's outfit, complete with miniature sandals or caligae. The soldiers thought it was adorable, and thus nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots. Cute? Absolutely. Scarring? Well, he would spend the rest of his life trying to kill anyone who called him that. But childhood cosplay was the least strange thing about his early years, because behind the military parades and matching outfits was a deep, festering hole of trauma, paranoia, and dynastic dysfunction that would have made the Targaryens look like a stable nuclear family. Let's talk about daddy issues, Emperor edition. Germanicus was being groomed to take over the empire. He was charming, popular, fluent in both Latin and public adoration, and that made him dangerous, at least in the eyes of Emperor Tiberius, his adoptive uncle. Germanicus was sent east on a diplomatic mission in 19 CE and, surprise, suddenly died in Antioch under extremely suspicious circumstances. Ancient historians hint at poison, political scheming, and a shadowy figure named Piso, who might have had a vial and a motive. Caligula was just 6 years old when his father died, and the death sent his mother Agrippina into a rage spiral. She didn't just grieve, she raged against Tiberius, accusing him of orchestrating the death and swearing to make him pay. The Roman court was less House of Cards and more Game of Thrones at this point. Naturally, this didn't go over well. Agrippina was eventually exiled and starved to death, as were 2 of Caligula's brothers. One was executed, another was imprisoned until he died. His other sister, Drusilla, was spared for now. By the time Caligula was a teenager, most of his immediate family had been removed like inconvenient furniture, and he'd learned one crucial Roman lesson: survival meant silence. Tiberius, possibly out of guilt, strategy, or a twisted sense of mentorship, brought Caligula to live with him on the island of Capri, where the emperor had retreated like a moody Bond villain with a taste for wine, whispers, and alleged depravity. Young Caligula lived there for years, watching Tiberius run an empire from a paranoid clifftop villa, indulging in what historians diplomatically call debauched distractions. Nobody's quite sure what Caligula saw on Capri, but one thing's clear: he learned how to fake loyalty like a champion. He reportedly told Tiberius, "I must be careful not to say anything about this man that the gods might hear." And that's how you survive a dictator's villa. By the time he was 24, Caligula had outlived almost everyone who might have had a better claim to the throne. He'd seen emperors poison, exile, and execute. He'd worn baby armor, watched his mother be destroyed by politics, and learned that if the gods didn't kill you, senators probably would. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, possibly helped along by Caligula and a timely suffocation pillow, the Roman Empire didn't just gain a new emperor, it gained a walking storm cloud of trauma, ambition, and unresolved childhood rage wrapped in a toga. The Senate welcomed him like a returning god. The people rejoiced. They cheered the boyish charm, the famous bloodline, and the illusion that this was the heir of Germanicus, not the long-suffering survivor of a dynastic meat grinder. But behind that fresh face was a man who had been trained by tragedy and refined by cruelty. And he didn't forget. Because if your childhood was a mix of dead relatives, whispering senators, and military cosplay, you'd probably grow up weird too. And Caligula, oh, he didn't just grow up weird. He grew up ready to make the whole empire dance to his madness. When Caligula became emperor in 37 CE, Rome practically exploded with joy. The Senate cheered. The people cheered. Even the temples probably threw up their hands and went, "Sure, let's give this one a chance." Because to understand the Roman mood at that moment, you have to remember what they'd just survived. 16 years of Tiberius. Tiberius had ruled like a man who mistook paranoia for a personality trait. He was gloomy, secretive, and about as cuddly as a scorpion in a bathrobe. He spent his final years ruling the empire from the island of Capri, where rumor said he lounged around in pools of vice, whispering orders through scribes while surrounded by statues, astrologers, and a disturbingly high number of poisoned figs. So when young, charismatic Gaius Caligula Caesar, the grandson of Augustus, the son of the beloved Germanicus, the golden child with the big eyes and even bigger name, took the throne, Rome felt like it had finally opened a window and let some fresh air in. People wept in the streets. Crowds mobbed the Senate steps just to glimpse him. He pardoned political prisoners. He gave generous bonuses to the army. He held lavish public games and abolished some of Tiberius's cruelest policies. The treasury took a hit, but the morale skyrocketed. Even the Senate, which normally treated emperors like they were lion-taming bears, applauded cautiously, but with clear relief. After all, Caligula wasn't just popular, he was bloodline royalty. He was a direct descendant of Augustus through his mother, and of Antony through his grandmother. If Rome had a royal family, Caligula was the last shiny coin left in the jar. And here's the wild part. For the first few months of his reign, he ruled well, really well. He was generous, respectful, relatively, and eager to please. He seemed to be healing a fractured empire. The people called him our baby Augustus. Bread flowed, circuses dazzled, senators dared to smile again. For once everyone thought, maybe this won't go terribly. And then Caligula got sick, really dramatically, terrifyingly sick. Exactly what happened is unclear. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio suggest it was either a severe fever, a brain infection, or the Roman equivalent of a full-body system crash. He was bedridden for weeks. Some thought he'd die. Others whispered about poison, possibly from political rivals, maybe even from within his own court, but he didn't die. Instead, he recovered, and when he emerged, something had changed. Imagine if your favorite boy band disappeared mid-tour and came back as a thrash metal group made entirely of chainsaws. That's how Rome felt. The charming young man who once handed out gifts and gave inspiring speeches was now darker, moodier, and seemingly held together by equal parts vinegar and divine entitlement. He began wearing dramatic robes, talking more about his personal divinity, and openly mocking senators in front of their peers. He started showing up late to meetings, if at all. He gave orders that seemed designed to humiliate, confuse, or terrify. People whispered that he wasn't just sick, he'd gone mad. Even modern historians can't fully agree on whether this was a medical turning point or just the moment the mask slipped. Some theories suggest temporal lobe damage, others lead poisoning, and still others say this was simply the real Caligula, traumatized, theatrical, and no longer bothering to pretend otherwise. He began demanding public worship, not as a metaphorical divine emperor, but as an actual living god. Temples were rededicated to him. Statues of Jupiter had their heads replaced with his own. He would appear in public dressed as Apollo or Mercury or Venus, because gender to Caligula was less about rules and more about vibes. He started to talk less like a politician and more like the main villain in a Greek tragedy, except with better hair and a strong emphasis on personal branding. "Let them hate me so long as they fear me," he reportedly said, which, to be fair, is also something a cat might say if it could speak Latin. People who had once toasted his name now tiptoed around his moods. Those who once called him Rome's hope now kept a dagger closer than usual. The city began to buzz with new energy, and it wasn't hope anymore. It was dread. Caligula had gone from poster boy to nightmare sequel in the span of one fever, and nobody knew if it was temporary or if the entire empire had just been handed to a man who ruled like reality was optional. So what changed? Was it illness? Power? Or had the trauma of surviving one of Rome's most brutal dynasties finally cracked him open like a bad egg? Whatever the cause, the Caligula Rome thought they were getting was gone, and the one who replaced him? Let's just say, the Senate was about to miss Tiberius. Badly. By the time Caligula recovered from his mysterious illness, Rome had stopped clapping and started sweating. At first, people thought maybe his behavior was just eccentric, a phase, a post-fever adjustment period, perhaps. But then he started holding conversations with statues, scheduling meetings with gods, and redecorating the imperial palace, as if Olympus had a clearance sale, and it became very clear. The madness wasn't inside the palace anymore. It was in charge. Caligula had gone fully off script, off rails, and possibly off planet. And for Rome, the capital of order and stoicism, this was like watching a toga-clad Shakespeare villain take over a talk about absolute power. Let's start with the god complex, which wasn't so much a psychological issue as a literal lifestyle choice. Caligula didn't just flirt with the idea of being divine. He jumped into it like it was a warm bath. He declared himself a living god, demanded to be worshipped, and had temples rededicated in his name. Not next to Jupiter, not beneath Apollo, equal or better. He reportedly walked into the temple of Jupiter, pointed at the statue and declared, "Now, it's your turn to worship me." He even replaced Jupiter's head with a statue of himself, because nothing screams humility like decapitating the king of gods and swapping in your own face. His favorite costume? Not a Roman general or emperor. No, he dressed as divine figures, Mercury with winged sandals, Apollo with a lyre, even Venus because gender roles meant nothing when your ego was orbiting Saturn. And the people? Oh, they complied. Priests scrambled to include Caligula's name in prayers. Senators built altars. Citizens were required to sacrifice to him. And woe to the man who didn't bow just right. One man reportedly forgot to mention Caligula in his oath, and was executed for it. The gods may have been forgiving, but the emperor was micromanaging immortality. But religion was just the appetizer. Caligula's true gift was turning the imperial court into a surreal performance art piece, where logic, decency, and basic laws of nature were subject to sudden rewrite. He didn't just mock senators, he broke them. He forced noblemen to run alongside his chariot in public. Others were commanded to dance, sing, or strip at parties, often for the emperor's amusement and the public's horror. If you had prestige, Caligula wanted to see how much of it he could smear in front of a crowd. It's not a cult if you're the emperor, it's just Tuesday. Senators lived in terror, not because of laws. Caligula wasn't big on consistency, but because his wrath was completely unpredictable. A man could be praised as a loyal citizen in the morning and beheaded in the afternoon for having an annoying voice. He was said to read the faces of his guests at dinner, looking for the slightest twitch, yawn, or raised eyebrow. One wrong expression and you could go from wine to execution in under 10 minutes. He also abolished trials for a time, opting for instant judgment, which is a lot less impressive when it's done by a man who once claimed he could move the moon with his mind. And in case you thought he kept his chaos indoors, nope, he loved public executions, often turning them into a form of twisted theatre. He once held a series of games where, bored with the bloodshed, he ordered the arena emptied and replaced the remaining gladiators with members of the audience because who needs ticket holders when you can have sacrifices? He reportedly said, "I wish the Roman people had just one neck so I could cut it all at once," which is not a great line if you're trying to win Emperor of the Year. His sense of humor also leaned avant-garde sadist. Once, when there was a famine in the city, he mocked the suffering citizens by offering banquets of wax food. That's not a metaphor. He literally served inedible fake meals and watched people try to chew them. But perhaps the most absurd and revealing aspect of Caligula's reign was how he erased the line between court ritual and performance art. Government meetings became impromptu theatre. Decrees were dramatic monologues. He once ordered silence during a thunderstorm so he could listen to Jupiter's applause. Was this madness? Or was it a deeply strategic method of dominating through disorientation? Historians still debate whether Caligula lost his mind or simply used spectacle as a way to rule through fear, awe, and exhaustion. But to the people watching from the sidelines, it didn't matter. The emperor was no longer a man. He was a god, a critic, a producer, and the starring act in his own divine soap opera. And in this empire-wide theatre, there were only two roles, audience or victim. So let's say you're Caligula. You've already declared yourself a god, terrified the Senate, and turned dinner parties into executions with wine pairings. What do you do for an encore? You declare war on the ocean. No, this isn't satire. It's not a poetic metaphor. It's not an ancient version of performance art, although maybe. This is the real, historically attested moment where Rome's emperor, commander of the world's most powerful army, stood on the shores of Gaul and ordered his troops to attack the sea. Let's rewind for context. In 40 CE, Caligula decided it was time to prove himself as a military leader. Every emperor worth his laurel crown needed a conquest on his resume, and with his great-grandfather Augustus setting the standard, Caligula needed some fresh blood, or at least some headlines. His eyes turned toward Britain. Yes, that misty island full of fog, druids, and people who painted themselves blue. Julius Caesar had famously invaded it about a century earlier, but hadn't fully conquered it. So Caligula figured, why not finish the job? Nothing says divine emperor like stomping a few tribal kingdoms into submission. So he set out to Gaul, modern-day France, assembled his legions and prepared for the grand campaign. The army was confused but loyal. The Senate was terrified but silent. The gods probably started packing. And then things got weird. Instead of preparing ships or organizing supply lines, Caligula marched his troops to the beach, lined them up like a toga-wrapped Normandy invasion, and told them to attack the sea. Yes, the actual sea. He ordered the Roman legions to charge the waves, stab the surf, and collect seashells as trophies of war. Ancient historians, trying to keep a straight face, wrote that the seashells were referred to as spoils of the conquered ocean. One version claims he declared victory over Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, as if this had all been part of a carefully orchestrated divine campaign. Another suggests Caligula had a sudden anxiety attack about crossing the channel and tried to disguise his retreat as a bizarre triumph. Either way, the soldiers weren't impressed. These were seasoned fighters who'd survived German winters and Parthian arrows, and now they were standing knee-deep in salt water, stabbing foam while their emperor cheered from the shoreline in full armor. It's hard to know exactly what Caligula was thinking. Maybe it was a calculated humiliation of the legions to remind them that he, not the generals, was their true master. Maybe it was a cosmic performance piece aimed at proving his control over nature itself. Or maybe, just maybe, he really thought Neptune owed him a fight. Either way, Caligula brought swords to a water fight and still claimed victory. When the soldiers returned from their splashy conquest, they were forced to parade the seashells through nearby towns, as if returning from a heroic campaign. Crowds watched in confusion as the spoils of Neptune were carted past on ornate wagons, while the emperor smiled like he'd just won the Punic Wars. Then came the rewards. Caligula gave out medals, honors, and even bonus pay for the campaign, because in his eyes a god's war must come with divine compensation. It didn't matter that no enemy had been encountered, or that not a single British village had been seen, much less captured. The emperor had declared a win and everyone was expected to applaud. But Rome wasn't laughing. Back in the capital, the Senate tried to process the report without openly weeping. This wasn't just strange, it was humiliating. Rome prided itself on military glory, discipline, and conquest, and here was its emperor, treating the channel like a personal spa day gone rogue. The generals, meanwhile, began quietly grumbling. Soldiers might tolerate cruelty or even madness, but ridicule? That was dangerous, and this campaign had turned the legions into props in a divine comedy. No soldier wants his legacy to include a decorated assault on seashells, and Caligula, he returned from Gaul triumphant, held a celebratory parade in Rome, and declared the operation a grand success. Statues were erected, decrees were issued, poems were probably commissioned. Neptune, presumably, remained silent out of sheer embarrassment. Some sources say Caligula even planned a follow-up campaign against the gods of the underworld, because why stop at the sea when there's a whole supernatural underbelly waiting to be conquered? Whether this was delusion, strategy, satire, or something in between, one thing was clear: Rome's emperor wasn't leading an empire, he was directing a surrealist war movie. And the waves, well, they rolled in, rolled out, and quietly claimed victory by being the only ones not stabbed to death by their own side. By now, Rome had stopped asking, "Is Caligula okay?" and started asking, "Is this still real life?" Because after declaring war on the ocean and awarding seashells as war trophies, Emperor Caligula decided it was time to restructure his court, starting with a horse. Entering Incitatus, possibly the most pampered, politically overqualified horse in ancient history. His name meant swift, or full of energy, and he was Caligula's prized stallion, not just a racehorse but apparently his closest political advisor, spiritual guide, and dinner companion. It's unclear whether the horse was particularly good at public policy, but Caligula certainly thought he had potential, so he gave him a marble stable. Yes, marble, as in the stuff used for temples and emperors' tombs. The stable included an ivory manger, golden feed buckets, and a staff of servants assigned solely to the horse's comfort. This wasn't a barn, it was a luxury spa with hooves in mind. Now, most emperors might stop at gold-plated oats and call it a day, but Caligula, he was just getting started. He gave Incitatus a house, a literal house, complete with furniture, a dining room, and even guests, because what's an imperial equine without a social life? And then came the big promotion. priesthood. Yes, Caligula nominated Incitatus for high religious office. He intended, according to several ancient sources, to make him a consul, which was the Roman equivalent of promoting your schnauzer to Secretary of State. Now, some historians suggest that this was a calculated insult. By elevating a horse above the Senate, Caligula was mocking the entire political system, saying that even a horse would govern better than his human officials. Think of it as imperial trolling, first century style. But others aren't so sure. This wasn't a single incident. It was part of a much larger trend of Caligula replacing logic with spectacle and turning governance into an elaborate piece of absurdist theatre. He didn't just disrespect tradition, he lit it on fire, painted it gold and fed it to his horse. And the horse? Incitatus was just vibing. While senators whispered behind columns and generals quietly packed daggers, the imperial court looked more like a fever dream hosted by Dionysus and choreographed by a drunken architect. Floating parties were held on enormous ships fitted with ballrooms, fountains, and musicians, luxury yachts that functioned more like floating palaces. One such ship was so large and elaborately decorated that it had marble floors, heating systems, and actual vineyards on board. If you're wondering why the Roman treasury started looking like a piggy bank after a toddler's tantrum, well, now you know where the money went. Into floating brunch. Inside the palace itself, Caligula built a covered walkway lined with gold, an elevated platform so he could stride above visitors, and a throne room that could rotate because apparently standing still like a normal person was too pedestrian for a living god. He'd also build elaborate stages and invite guests to banquets where, mid-feast, the floor would collapse, dropping people into pools or cages of exotic animals. Surprise, you thought you were eating oysters. Nope, you're wrestling a leopard now. Good luck. And then there were the costumes. Caligula didn't just play God, he dressed the part. One day he might appear as Apollo, wearing a radiant sun crown. The next, he'd be dressed as Venus, with flowing robes and pearls. Occasionally he went for Mars, in full battle gear, sometimes flanked by armed guards, sometimes by flutes. To Caligula, the imperial wardrobe was a casting list, and reality was whatever the emperor decided to wear that morning. And through it all, Incitatus remained the star of the show. Guests at banquets were expected to treat the horse with the same reverence they gave senators. Some claimed that Incitatus had his own schedule of appointments, and visitors were instructed not to disturb the animal during important business hours. Whether that meant grazing or just napping in his marble suite, no one dared ask. Because if your emperor's dinner guest is a horse, you're not at a banquet, you're in a satire. And satire is exactly what Caligula seemed to be living. Whether his actions were the result of madness, malice, or method acting at God level, the message was clear. This empire belonged to him, and sanity was not on the guest list. By the time Caligula was a few years into his reign, Rome wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't applauding, bowing, or even whispering too loudly. They were watching, waiting, wondering when it would be their turn to disappear, because the emperor who once threw feasts and dressed like Venus had now graduated to imperial terror mode, and everyone from senators to slaves was on the chopping block. Let's be clear, Rome was no stranger to violence. This was a city that made gladiator shows a national pastime, but Caligula elevated fear to an Olympic event, and he didn't need lions to do it, just names. Names on lists. Sometimes they were real conspirators, sometimes they were imaginary ones, and sometimes they were just people he was bored of. One minute, a senator would be drinking wine at a banquet. The next, he was gagged, shackled, and politely informed he'd been condemned for looking treasonous in the sunlight. Caligula didn't bother with elaborate trials. He didn't need reasons. He had execution lotteries. Yes, actual lotteries. He would gather a group of nobles or soldiers, pull names from a jar or scroll like he was hosting a party game, and then announce the condemned right then and there. Congratulations, Gaius. You've won the grand prize, public strangulation. Tell him what else he's won, Lucius. The only thing more dangerous than being Caligula's enemy was being his friend for too long. Even his inner circle wasn't safe. In fact, especially not them. People who'd once laughed at his jokes now practiced neutral expressions in the mirror, because an accidental eye roll could earn them a fast track to the underworld. And if you thought family had immunity, think again. Caligula didn't just mistrust the Senate, he mistrusted blood. He exiled his sisters. He allegedly had affairs with them, then turned on them just as fast. Loyalty was a revolving door, and betrayal was baked into the architecture. One chilling rumor, courtesy of ancient gossip mongers like Suetonius, tells of a nobleman who refused to praise Caligula's divine singing voice. That was it. Not treason, not conspiracy, just musical honesty. He didn't clap loud enough, and his reward was death. Paranoia wasn't just a trait anymore, it was policy. The Senate, once filled with smug old men in togas, now resembled a room of hunted deer, nervously sipping wine and trying not to breathe too loudly. Caligula would show up, insult them all to their faces, call them cowards, and then smile like a schoolboy with a frog in his pocket. He mocked their speeches, interrupted their debates, and once told them he could wipe them all out and repopulate the Senate with horses. And considering his record with Incitatus, that wasn't even an idle threat, it was a performance review. One day he'd shower a senator with praise. The next, he'd send soldiers to their villa at dawn with a cheerful, "You know what you did." Sometimes they didn't even bother with soldiers. He enjoyed doing it himself. It said Caligula once executed a man during dinner, then casually resumed his meal as if nothing had happened. Even his guards started looking twitchy. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, weren't used to being part-time therapists. But under Caligula, their job now included managing a paranoid emperor who believed the gods whispered assassination plots into his ear during naps. And the people? At first they loved him, then they tolerated him. Now they barely spoke his name aloud. Markets went quiet when his entourage passed. Even jokes about him vanished because no one wanted to become Caligula's idea of a punchline. But while he was busy tormenting Rome, Rome was quietly sharpening its knives. Whispers of rebellion began. Low, dangerous ones that fluttered like moths near the Senate walls. Nobody said it directly, nobody dared, but questions hung in the air. How long can this go on? How do you stop a god who doesn't sleep and owns the army? And worst of all, what if he never gets bored of killing? Because that was the real terror. Caligula didn't need a motive, he needed a mood. Caligula didn't trust anyone, except maybe his horse, and even that was probably on thin ice. By now, even Incitatus was probably sleeping with one eye open and a getaway chariot hidden behind the marble stable. It was no longer about power, it was about control through chaos. Caligula had made himself unpredictable, untouchable, and absolutely terrifying. And in Rome, fear like that doesn't last forever. By early 41 CE, everyone in Rome had the same unspoken thought. How long can this circus last before the lion turns on the ringmaster? Caligula had crossed every imaginable line. Moral, political, religious, and then some that hadn't even existed until he made up new ones. He had insulted the Senate, threatened the equestrians, executed allies, humiliated generals, and made the gods compete with him for stage time. He had created an empire of fear, not loyalty, and the people who once cheered his name now held their breath each morning to see who might disappear next. But there's one group you really don't want to alienate when you're the self-declared living god of an empire: your bodyguards. The Praetorian Guard was an elite unit tasked with protecting the emperor. In theory, they were his shield. In practice, they were also the only people close enough to twist the knife, and twist it they did. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula walked through a passageway beneath the Palatine Hill, inside the Imperial Theatre complex. He'd just left a series of public games, possibly still dressed like Mercury or Jupiter, depending on his vibe that day. As he strolled along with a small entourage, including some unfortunate actors, a group of conspirators emerged from behind the curtains, led by a tribune named Cassius Chaerea. Now, Chaerea had plenty of reasons to hate Caligula. He was a seasoned officer and a man of serious demeanor, exactly the type Caligula enjoyed mocking in public. The emperor had reportedly nicknamed him Venus and Sweetie Pie, poking fun at his voice and masculinity whenever the chance arose, because nothing motivates a man to stab like years of imperial roast sessions. "You mock my sword, let's test it," might have been the unspoken sentiment of the day. As Caligula passed, Chaerea and the other assassins pounced, swords were drawn. The emperor, the god, the star, the chaos conductor was cut down in a storm of blades, right there in the theatre corridor. Some accounts claim he screamed, "I'm still alive," while trying to crawl away. Others suggest he died instantly. Either way, he didn't get an encore. His wife Caesonia and young daughter were also executed shortly after. The conspirators wanted to make sure no miniature Caligulas remained to carry the madness forward. Rome held its breath. Surely the heavens would split open. Surely lightning would strike. The god emperor had been killed. Shouldn't the world tremble? But instead, silence. Deep, stunned, awkward silence. No uprisings, no divine vengeance, no thunderbolts, just an eerie calm. Because as it turned out, a lot of people were kind of relieved. Even those who hadn't dared conspire nodded quietly to themselves and thought, "Yeah, that tracks." With Caligula's blood still soaking into the floorboards, the Senate tried to take control. They briefly debated restoring the Republic, as if Rome could just reboot and pretend the last 70 years had been a weird fever dream. But before the ink was dry on their democratic fantasies, the Praetorian Guard had already found a new emperor, Claudius, Caligula's bumbling, stuttering uncle who had been hiding behind a curtain during the assassination like a terrified librarian at a prison riot. Claudius, who had long been seen as a harmless oddball and scholarly joke, was suddenly the last man standing with Julio Claudian blood, and now the army's pick for emperor. The Senate blinked, the people blinked, Claudius blinked, probably twice as hard, and Rome carried on. So what do we make of Caligula? Ancient sources like Suetonius, Cassius Dio and Josephus paint him as an unhinged lunatic, a man who thought he was a god, married his sister, tried to make his horse consul, and declared war on Neptune, a fever dream in sandals. But modern historians raise a cautious eyebrow. Much of what we know about Caligula comes from survivors, specifically survivors who hated him, feared him, or needed to justify stabbing the emperor in a theatre hallway. So maybe he wasn't as unhinged as the history books claim, or maybe he was worse. Perhaps he wasn't clinically insane, but strategically unhinged, using shock, awe, and divine theatrics to keep Rome paralyzed, while keeping power firmly in his golden-fisted grip. Either way, one thing's for certain, Caligula learned the hard way that calling yourself a god doesn't make you immortal. And when he fell, the entire empire exhaled, because the man who claimed to rule the heavens was ultimately no match for a short sword and a long grudge.